You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
Hey, Power Athlete Nation, I want you to strap in for another riveting podcast with Mr. Dane Miller. Dane is a strength conditioning coach, USA weightlifting, USA track. He's worked with professional athletes, Olympic athletes in all the last bunch of Olympic Games. He is a shot putter that threw at Penn State, lives in Pennsylvania, the heartbeat of America out there outside of Reading. And not only that, but is a father, husband, and a father of twins. And as anybody knows, listen to this podcast, you know that as a father of twins, we tend to be kindred spirits. So I'm going to leave you with this caveat. I had a whole bunch of questions I was planning on asking him. We got to none of them because we were trying to solve the world's problems, and I think I spoke too much. So if you can guess, I probably drank a little too much coffee. So I'm going to caveat this so nobody leaves any bad review that John's talking too much. Just know we were tearing it the fuck up. So buckle up, Mr. Dane Miller. Random story. I bought a 68 Shelby Mustang GT500 out of a dude's barn up in that area. And what had happened was the guy in like 1982 had traded that car for a brand new Fiero, which was a hilarious story in itself. The guy gets the car. It's all original. Great. So he and his buddy get on a Friday afternoon, decide they're going to go down to the local spot and have a few beers. Coming home as they're going on the jug handle on the turnaround, I guess it had started raining and there was a little water on the ground. And the guy basically puts the car into the rail, smashes it up, is totally nervous because he's shit-faced, limps it home, puts it in the garage, puts a cover on it, and doesn't touch it for like 25 years. So my buddy calls me and he goes, "Hey man, I know where this, cause I've always been into cars and I was never a Ford guy. But I always thought Shelbys were cool." So, he calls me and he goes, "Hey, you got to come get this thing. This guy wants to sell it." So we yank it out of his garage for a real cheap price. And he's telling me the story. One, that he traded it for a Fiero, which was hilarious. Yeah, two, how he wrecked it. And then the guy collected all these parts and, I'm going to fix it up one day. So it's sitting in my shop. I got to put the motor back in it and do some wiring. But it's, from that part of the world. But I remember when we were pulling up, it was like jug handle. I could see the bar, and then we went up, and it was like this, house with a detached garage, and it was just in the middle of farm stuff. And I remember pulling up, thinking like, "Man, this dude's got a Shelby in here under a tarp, in a barn, in just Western PA, like it's." And then as you're driving, you're like wondering, like, should we knock on everybody's door and see what they have in their barns? And that's
everybody has something.
Yeah, that's what my buddy does.
Dead bodies, cars, trucks.
Dude, that's what my buddy does. He like drives around on days off, knocks on people's doors, gets to know them. And then as a job, when people pass away, he goes in and cleans out their houses.
Okay,
and
my wife's aunt does that.
Oh yeah, it's
crazy.
Yeah, he has a rare propensity towards it because he took a shot in the head when he was a kid, so he has no sense of smell. Like, that there's a nerve that goes in your forehead that if it gets severed, you can't smell anything. So he got hit with a rake or something and he can't smell. So he has no problem going in. Like, there's no fucking way I could do it. Like, I can't even talk to people
that have cat piss or cigarette smoke.
Dude, people have bad breath and I walk away. Like at jiu-jitsu, if somebody doesn't wash their gi or isn't into personal hygiene, I'm like, I just fucking like, they'll be going to roll. I'm like, no, I'm good. I'll go with somebody else. And I wish I didn't have the like overwhelming sense of smell. That's like when all these people were like getting COVID and they're like, "Oh, I can't smell." I'm like, fuck, I would take that any day to be like overly sensitive on smell. And like, people don't brush their teeth or just like at jits, like they'll like wear the gi 2 days in a row or like they roll in the morning. And then at night, it just kind of gets that like funk on it. And I'm like, ugh, it stinks. So, and a bunch of dudes smoke weed too, which is even more funny because then I'm like, "I know you smoke weed, dude. It's fine."
Yeah. And then they smell like skunk mixed with ball sweat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's like funky weed smell, but there's a big, I blame Joe Rogan for a lot of things. Probably one is this whole podcasting thing is probably Joe Rogan's fault.
Fair,
but the other one is Austin, where we live, was a pretty nice place until Joe Rogan moved here and he got on his podcast and talked about how great it was. And then it like tripled in size. Like they should give that dude the key to the city. He should have owned something for it. And then the other one is weed and jujitsu. So like I see dudes like huffing, not like old dudes, like young guys in their 20s, like huffing in the car before they come in. They're like, Joe Rogan says, it helps with jujitsu to get high. I'm like, fuck, dude, I got to pick my kids up, dude. Let's go.
Yeah, leave me alone. I just want to freaking grapple a little.
Yeah,
it's funny because it's like then you get the guy who doesn't wash his gi. He smells like skunk and ball sweat, and then 3 days later you got impetigo, and you're like, dude, all you had to do was shower, and you forgot because you were so high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a weird deal. I've only gotten ringworm, I think, like one time, and at that point I kind of like not freaked out, but like playing in the NFL, like hygiene was always a big thing to me, like athlete's foot and that. Like I don't know, man, like that stuff I think is indicative for bigger health issues. Like if you can't get rid of athlete's foot or all these like skin disorders that you see people have, like I think they're just indicative of something else. Obviously the skin being your biggest organ, it just manifests a lot of stuff. So I think if you're like constantly dealing with that, it means you're broken on the inside. So I was always very conscious of like, avoiding those things. So I have like those, I think it's called like defend wipes. After I get done, I'll always kind of like wipe down. But I'm also like just pretty clean person. So like, you have kids too, which is funny because I joke that my kids are dirt merchants, that like little kids, you have to like force them to be clean. So now that my daughters are like 12, they're going on 13. I always talk to them. I'm like, like today I dropped my daughter off and I was like, hey, they have gym first period. So I was like, hey, where are your clothes? She's like, oh, I left them in the locker from yesterday. And I was like, you didn't bring them home to wash them? She's like, no, we just lifted weights. I didn't get sweaty. And I was like, you've obviously never lifted with me because I fucking get done. Like we trained yesterday and I was covered. So, but like, hey man, you got to bring that stuff home. Like make sure like, you 2 pairs of shoes rotating through, like clean your socks, like being able to, like teach your kids that is important, but it's also funny to talk to 20 something or 30 something year old people that haven't dealt with that stuff.
About the same exact shit. It's like, it's funny because there's these 2 professors, they're at Stanford, the Sonnenbergs, and they talk about gut flora and like microbiota, and they have this study called Fee Fi Fo, and they actually talk about how people with dogs tend to have more developed gut flora, and in turn, in theory, they'll be less likely to have autoimmune disorders or anything along those lines because their gut tends to be healthier. And when I was reading through all this stuff and just thinking through it myself and whatever, I'm like, but what about kids? Like if dogs bring in their dander gets in the air and then you consume that, and that can actually fuel your gut flora. My children are outside covered in leaves and dirt and chicken shit. It's like, so does that mean that children are also dogs? And they like, I want to see the study on that. Like people with children also have more developed gut flora than people without children, simply based off of that factor.
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Do you want to build thick, sidewalk-splitting slabs of muscle? Let me introduce you to Jack Street. Get access to the same tried and true training methods I followed during my 10 years in the NFL, all to walk into training camp at 308 pounds at sub 8% body fat. Punch your ticket to the gain train and join thousands of residents already following Jack Street. Head to powerathletehq.com/Jack Street and claim your 7-day free trial today. Now back to the show. You do not need a study for that one. So there is we had Dr. Sabine Hazen, who's one of like the top people for this deal. She's got a lab out in California. There's a symbiotic relationship between humans and the soil. So the microbiome and like the microbes in the soil are a directly mirror for what's within us, to the point where she told a great story about, she was in Africa and there was elephants, and they were on this game preserve, and this elephant took a huge dump, and she's like, that's my deal. I collect stool samples. That's what I've done my whole life. So she goes over and collects a stool sample, and the stool elephant shit was covered in ticks. So she's scoops it up and she's like, oh shit. So in her mind, she's thinking, look at all these ticks, Lyme disease. So then the guy who was their, handler, like the guy taking him around, she like finally convinces him to like, hey, when you take a dump, I need you to give me a sample. So the guy does it. They get home and she's expecting to find Lyme disease rampant. She ends up finding a strain of bacteria in the elephant that she had never identified before that was also in the gut of the local people. And when they went back and did a little bit of research, it was a bacteria from Lyme disease. So what had effectively happened is they were immune to Lyme disease because they shared similar bacteria with what was in between the elephants. So her theory is based on this idea of like the Garden of Eden, right? Like let's say you have like a perfect gut biome, that all-cause mortality disappears. So like the stories that all these, Hadza, and she went to like the Amazon and all over, like dealt with these people that hadn't necessarily been touched by modern society. And she's like, their guts are so robust. The diversity is so high and they have strains of bacteria that we've never seen. So imagine like you take all the strains of bacteria through history that people have and you make this, like she called it Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, right? Like the stories that she heard were in these tribes that people don't necessarily die of what we die of. Like they either get killed by an animal or, killed in battle, let's say, or, something hostile, or they just get old and go to sleep and don't wake up. So they don't have cancer. They don't, and which is, if you go back to the Weston Price stuff where,
similar.
I mean, he observed the same thing and he was like, oh, these people don't die of the same diseases. They don't have diabetes. They don't have cancer. They don't have this. He kind of fucked it up a little bit in that he thought it was the food. It wasn't the food. It was that the people's gut bacteria and their microbiome was adept to the point where, they lived in nature, they didn't necessarily wash their hands. I mean, they were in the dirt and the dust and sleeping in it and living in it. And, like you said, playing in it, and they're covered and they're hunting in it. And the relationship with the animals and the dust and everything, and even the people they're around. So the microbiome is not only what's in you, it's the soil, it's the people you're around, and your environment. And so when you create this kind of like imagine two pieces of Velcro meshing together, now you've basically fought off all-cause mortality. And so Weston Price was like, oh, it's the diet. Well, you have the Hadza that eat, fruit, honey, and wild game, right? And they dig these tubers and eat this, honey. So they're like high carbohydrate. And then you look at the Maasai who have blood and milk. It's like a fermented milk mixed with blood in this porridge.
Zubu.
Yeah. And
Zubu
so
cow.
These guys are basically two similar, like different groups, but they eat kind of very different diets in terms of macronutrients, and yet they're all extremely healthy and they have the same outcomes. So the healthiest people on the planet are the people that have adapted to their diets and their food and their surroundings. So it kind of changed after the podcast, completely changed my perception of this stuff. So long story short, it's fucking great that your kids are out playing in the dirt, covered in mud, chicken shit, all that other stuff. All that's doing is it's increasing their diversity and making them more resilient in terms of the gut. And, we're also in this world where, somebody gets sick, instantly we have to fix it. And that's this like disease model of health that we have, which is totally broken. Like when you get sick and your immune system gets challenged, like that's a challenge. It's like lifting weights. Like, hey, I worked to failure.
Let it go.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you have to be resilient enough. The problem is we've become so non-resilient that we need something to help this. So when I worked with Dr. Hazen and she did my gut, like my gut diversity was like a 7-8, which basically puts me like as a Midwest farmer. My daughter, Jamie, was like an 8-4, which pretty much makes her like a low-level Hadza. And, bifidobacteria, we went through it. And then the hilarious one is she's from North Africa. She's Moroccan by descent. So she pulled her gut up and was like showing me, she's like, oh, here's a very specific strain of bacteria that's related to people that only people in North Africa have, like in people from the Middle East. And she's like, I can tell where your family is from geography wise, based upon all these kind of like very like siloed pieces of gut bacteria. So then she's going through me and she's like, holy shit, you have the exact same thing. She's like, do you have family from that part of the world? I'm like, no, my grandparents came from Denmark. My grandmother came from Sweden and my other grandparents came from Ireland. No. So, but I train and roll a lot with a guy named Arash, who's from, Iran. And
then you share that probably.
so she's like, it's probably the fact that you roll with a bunch and train with a bunch of Brazilians daily, and you have a guy from the Middle East who you're real close with, and do jits with him multiple times and this. And she's like, it could be the fact, or you just have some random strain of the family where now it's in, but yet it wasn't in my daughter, it wasn't in anybody else. So it's kind of expanded my thought of more than just like the gut and the foods we eat. It's, finding whatever, diet you're most adept to or adapted to, and, living within nature, like getting your hands dirty, doing out, like going and doing all those things. Like that's the greatest determining factor for health and longevity that we found. So it's pretty interesting that we're in this disease kind of fixed culture where there's a pill for everything, but yet, everything that they do, whether it be, look at how many things destroy gut bacteria. And then think about glycophosphate and all the shit they're putting in the ground, stripping away the microbiome of the soil. Now, all of a sudden we wonder why we're less healthy. I'm always fascinated by, and this too in the strength conditioning world, where everybody thinks everything is so siloed, right? Like I'm going to develop hypertrophy. I'm doing hypertrophy training, but yet I'm going to do strength training. And I remember seeing all this early on, and like just kind of naturally evolving into like a concurrent training model where I'm like, when in history have we ever just done one thing? Like to say that you were just going to, I'm going to do nothing but, conditioning on one block and then here and here. And it just seemed broken to me. This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show.
Yeah, that's interesting. It made me think about was one of the papers I read on the GLP-1s. The positive is that these super obese people they have like horrific gut flora, and like they don't eat any real food, and then they have this like leaky gut syndrome. And one of the things that and then that creates these cravings. And one of the things outside of decreasing their appetite was that their gut from the whether it's semaglutide or tirzepatide or whatever, it was sealing their gut, and then they had less cravings even when they were going off of the GLP-1s because their gut was actually tighter.
Yeah.
So it's like interesting how the hormones of all that also factor into the microbiome of your gut versus the soil, and what that person who was probably severely obese, and it's sort of like a cheat code to get them back into getting over to eating well. I don't know. I thought about that when you were talking about it, because it's interesting how that's all related, but it still goes back to the attitude of like, we've got to fix this problem after it happens, instead of being like, well, let's just let this problem occur and let it mitigate itself, and then over time let's try to prevent that from occurring again. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The GLP-1s are fascinating. We had Doc Parsley on the podcast who, actively prescribes it and does this type of work. And he said what happened was they were bringing people in and doing like, the deal where they like resect like the stomach, and they were taking out parts of colon. And even when the people were like, obese and they had type 2, as soon as they did it, within 7 days, they were no longer type 2 diabetics. Mm-hmm. So they were like, they didn't lose any weight. All they did was they just removed like tissue. And that what got them kind of going down with these GLP-1s. I think they're fascinating. I think obesity, and this is, I'll strap on my tinfoil hat, but it's not necessarily a tinfoil hat because it's just intelligence. People are healthier when they're less fat. However they get less fat, it doesn't really matter. Like, it just matters that like being less fat is equal to healthy. Now, how you get there, and so if you notice now, all of these hit pieces on the GLP-1s and tirzepatide and Ozempic, now it destroys collagen. Just look at Big Pharma is shitting their pants because Big Pharma is already feeling the hit. Because if you have something that makes people less fat, 80% of the medications and all the stuff that Big Pharma is pushing are managing dietary, effects of just overeating and obesity. I mean, fat is oxidative. Muscle is extremely insulin sensitive. When you're in this kind of obese, oxidative state all the time, all-cause mortality shoots through the roof. So now all of a sudden they're taking these shots once a week, which isn't extremely, tedious. And they're becoming less fat. And then it's also, it creates behavior modification. Now people are losing cravings and it's fixing a lot of things. And if you notice, all of these hit pieces are coming out. Like the one I saw the other day is it's destroying collagen. So now it's going to make you look old and have a saggy face if you do this. I would rather have an old saggy face than to be obese.
Be a fat fuck.
Yeah. And
they say that about muscle mass. Hey, guess what? The people who are on GLP-1 and still resistance training 3 days a week, they didn't lose muscle mass as long as they ate enough protein.
Yeah.
And then you see, I think it was Nestle even put something out like they're genuinely concerned about the food system because the food system is so tied to all this. And they're like, oh my gosh, people are going to be eating a little less.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? It's like, yo, this is crazy. This is like actually one of the few drugs that's like freaking phenomenal. And people are just shitting on it for getting people to be less heavy.
Well, it's because the food is built on whether or not you buy into the Lane Norton hype where it's like it's all bullshit. Like the food is hyper palatable. They have brought in food scientists, and I know because I am partnered in a food company and I owned a food company and I've worked with food scientists a pretty solid amount. They bring in the sharpest food scientists that they can. They do a lot of testing. They know how to make foods super highly palatable. Like the Doritos thing, like literally they know nobody can eat one Doritos. Like the packaging is designed by Vegas people, the way it's pitched, the whole crunch, everything about it is designed to access every part of our brain. And because it's so hyper palatable, people tend to overeat. And, if you go back and you're like, oh yeah, okay, it is calories in, calories out. But if they're hacking into something within our hardware that's beyond most people's control, and also if they're obese, look at all the other hormonal issues, right? You're talking about the brain. I mean, this is where we get stuck in this idea of like siloed. No, it's systemic. They do scans of people's brains that are obese and they can see, less gray matter, less this. I mean, they know that muscle is extremely insulin sensitive. We know that it's your greatest hedge against longevity and health. And, we had Gabrielle Lyon on talking about muscle-centric medicine. I mean, it's a real deal. If you lift weights and you're pretty jacked and you carry a low amount of body fat, you're extremely metabolically sensitive, which is what everybody's hoping for. There's no literature that talks about, how you got there. It's just, are you lean and carry muscle, insulin sensitive? If you carry a lot of fat, you're not. So you can't use between carbohydrates and fat easily. And now they have something where it looks like a shot and people are like, oh, it's cheating. And I'm like, yeah, but we're past the point of like cheating at this point with it. Like, is it cheating? Not really. If people are sick and they need to
you want them to get a lap band? You want them to get a gastric bypass?
Well, they would rather you do the first two because that's a huge hit for insurance. And what will happen too is that when they get the lap band, and if you look at the outcomes from lap band and also the gut resection deal, the stomach eventually stretches back into its original size because they haven't done anything to do the behavior modification. And that's what the GLP-1's doing is they are doing behavior modification and, reducing craving, making people less do it. And when they come off it, they're kind of different people. I mean, I was kind of not against it just because I'm naturally suspicious of big pharma anyway. Just because, the same people that made billions of dollars selling, all these different pain meds, like the OxyContin story where those people made trillions of dollars and like, oh, this is bad for people. So I've always been a little kind of skeptical of big pharma and this bullshit. But I think for this thing, man, I don't really see a negative. And then when I had Doc Parsley on and he kind of got real deep on it, I was like, shit, dude, this isn't a bad thing. He's like, if you're a healthy individual, you got to have a solution for what it looks like to get off it. But for people that are broken, Like they just might go down to like a small microdose, like 0.25 once a week, and they might just live there the rest of their lives. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's helping them be less fat.
The issue is they're gonna, okay, so to echo that, one of my best friends was on Wegovy for 2 years, comes off, and he's like, dude, now he gained like 3 pounds back on average over the span of 6 months. And he's like, I used to want to eat 5 slices of pizza. Now I have 1 slice of pizza. I'm good. I don't need more. It's a total habit change. But the problem is, I think there's 2 factors here. You have people that, let's say you're on Facebook or you're on, you see somebody lose weight and you haven't done it. So then they get negative and they're like, oh, well, I'm going to talk shit on that person, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to say, I'm jealous of that individual. That's one aspect. And then they'll say, now I'm starting to see more because, athletes in a body weight category or bodybuilders, they're going to go on Wegovy and then they go full blast on 5 or 6 other drugs, anabolics. And then they're like lumping them into this light of like, oh, well, look, bodybuilders are using Wegovy or whatever.
Are they using it? Like they're
using on the cut.
So
from my understanding.
Oh shit. Like I asked Parsley about it where I was like, are bodybuilders using this to cut to like, with their dieting with a bunch of drugs? And he's like, I don't know. And when I looked it up on the internet, I didn't necessarily see anybody coming out admitting it, but like it makes total sense. I'm like, well, dude, if it's doing all these and it makes you less hungry, because what it does, so this is fascinating, and you know this, dude. Like when you cut calories, you have like leptin, and all of a sudden you go into this like deficit, and then your metabolism slows down. When you go into that deficit using those drugs, the metabolism doesn't slow down, and you don't get into the crash. So like that's, as soon as he said that, I was like, fuck, are bodybuilders using it? So I'm kind of, dude, I'm interested to hear, are these dudes taking 4 or 5 drugs and this and getting fucking way more jacked?
That's my understanding of the realm currently. And I'm going to be 100% transparent, is that when I started to read about these, they've been around, I want to say for 20 plus years, but I follow, I think his name's Spencer Arnoldski. And he likes to troll other doctors. He actually reminds me of Lane Norton. He was talking about it like maybe 3 years ago. So I was like, what the hell is this? So I looked at it and I'm like, well, these are, I at the time had a girl trying to qualify for Paris. And I'm like, this chick, so she's a savage, right? And she's a weightlifter. And she, by this age, she's like 23, and like she would cut down to 49 kilos from like 52 and a half. It's a pretty hard cut. And I was like, I hit up the guy who runs the head of the head of performance, high performance in the NGB. And I'm like, there's nothing against using this for cutting for weightlifting. And he was like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. So we never actually used it, but I was like, why aren't more people doing this? Like, this is an easy way to cut in a class, in a sport that has a weight class. Now, I think it does, looking back at that, it definitely blurs the line, but it's not a banned substance. And that's where I think the bodybuilders are taking advantage of it currently. And I think there's a lot of, like, if you ask me, dude, you look at a triple jumper, you look at a high jumper, why wouldn't they take it? They should be taking it. And then you look at bodybuilders, and if they're able to maintain their protein intake while substantially cutting calories, like, and they're full blasting, think about they're on somebody's, I don't know, fucking Anavar and test. And
so years ago, when I was, I'd moved back to California, so I was playing for the Chiefs. I used to train at a local gym, and there were some pro bodybuilders in there, and they were, the only dudes that were legitimately strong enough to train with. So I kind of became buddies with them, and like they're like basically have like these like packets, and they're taking fucking Dianabol in the middle of the workout, and they were real fucking strong. But I was also real big and strong, and obviously though I'm getting drug tested 26 times a year, so it's like, fuck, dude, I can't do any of that shit. And so, they were 240, 245. I was like, 310, 305, 310. And I remember we trained, and I, I think growing up, and I'm sure, dude, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but like, I remember when I started lifting weights, like seeing like Flex Magazine, and like the old power lifter that trained me, a guy named George Zangus, in his garage, used to have a supplement company called Marathon Nutrition, and he invented the super suits and the wraps. So they used to send him all these magazines. So we would always go over there and like read all the bodybuilding magazines and Powerlifting USA and all the strongman shit. And then he trained like Bill Kazmaier and those guys on the Thompson powerlifting deal. So we were kind of around it a bunch. And I like just naively, like they don't talk about drugs. Like nobody really talked about it. So it wasn't until I met those dudes and they were trying to explain to me like the volumes of which they were taking. And like these were just like local guys that were winning like, you know, Mr. California and USA, Mr. USA type of shit. Like they weren't like natural or like national pro bodybuilders. And so they were pretty honest about it. And I was like, oh, and then, you know, you get into the internet now and these guys are like, oh, I take, you know, this and this. And I'm like, wait a minute, this guy's a pro and he said he's taking this. And those guys took 10X with this guy just to win some local show. And this was the deal. So I think the bodybuilding world is pretty interesting about like lying about what they're taking and just claiming less, like, oh, I only take an HRT dose. And you're like, oh, yeah.
Bull.
Yeah. I was like, these guys are counting it in grams. Like they're like, oh, I'm taking, you know, 10 grams of drugs. And that was the way those guys, they kind of like tallied it all up. And I remember them being like, oh, I take 5 and then 7. It is fucking crazy. And I'm like, it just is such a foreign world. But the funny part is it takes years for this stuff to come out and for a bunch of these guys to die and figure out that, you know, insulin and growth hormone and all the other crazy shit. So maybe it just, they're using it and not necessarily it's not coming out. And then all of a sudden in 5 years, they're like, oh yeah, we were all using this stuff.
It'll be out. That's what I think. I think it'll be, I often feel like I often feel like the bodybuilders that are really on, they're so far ahead. They're very far ahead of like the game with all this stuff. And it's interesting when you talk to them, like the stuff that they're thinking about. I'm like, if you're not in it, if you don't, like for me, not being in it and being training athletes that are in tested sports.
Sure.
When I talk to a bodybuilding coach, it's like, dude, these people know a lot about all of this shit. It is crazy. Yeah. It's crazy, but
they also there's a lot of stuff that kind of skirts like wouldn't be called ethical, but isn't illegal. Like I just watched one of the guys that I do consult or I did a kind of I do a consult for him, just doing basically just so very sparingly. I do I wouldn't call it life coaching, but just like helping people get back on track for like high net worth individuals. So I got like a billionaire here locally and some other high net people that hit me up and pay me to consult. And it looks like, you know, helping them with their blood work and just kind of getting them in like the right direction, pairing them up with the right doctors and just like as a facilitator, kind of like I guess you could call like a high end, what would you call that? Like corporate wellness for rich people. Right. Yeah. So one of the
health wellness coach.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, what about this? What about this? Like, you know, like, I want to improve longevity. So all the research points to like hyperbarics and this, I mean, just like sifting through the bullshit. They don't want to have to go and ask, like, they just want to know what's this, who's the best person and where do I go? Mm-hmm. So, I was doing, you know, we have been, doing some stuff with the guys at Merrick Health. And sent him there, and I was like, "Hey, this is you know, probably like $3,000 to $5,000 panel that you can get for like $800, $850, I think." And so he sent me over kind of the report and all this, and he started asking me a bunch of questions like, "Hey, what about like injectable L-carnitine?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, fuck, I haven't heard about that in years." And I'm like, "People are still doing that?" And I got on, and it's a big deal now. And then as I was getting in, and I asked a few people I know, and they're like, "Oh, that stuff's great for leaning out. Like it just makes you real sweaty." And it's like a good performance and vitamins. I mean, there were a big back in the day thing is people were buying these horse vitamins, like these vitamins that were like for horses. And they were doing these horse vitamin injections because it had just insane amounts of everything. Like that's not necessarily legal. I mean, is it something that's maybe unethical or would people frown if you told them you were injecting horse vitamins? But that was one of the effects. But L-carnitine was one of the injectables I'd seen. And I just remember people complaining about like the injection sites and painful. But that was, you know, that popped up on that. And they asked me and I was like, oh, shit, I hadn't thought about that in years. And it just was interesting that there are these things that are kind of now in this, I guess you could call like performance wellness space and aren't necessarily drugs per se, but are kind of in this like kind of weird gray zone. And the guy, I ended up reaching out to a dude, and he's like, "Oh yeah, like all athletes are doing this." And I was like, "Really, all athletes?" Because when I was playing, I never like this one.
Yeah, you never did it. Right?
Yeah, I never did. It wasn't prevalent, and I didn't hear much about it. But it's kind of funny where this stuff kind of runs with an ebb and flow, where it disappears and comes back, and now it's one. I mean, that's and we just got done. I know you work with a bunch of Olympic athletes, but like looking at, I mean, I love the Olympics. It's my favorite time of year when it pops up. Once every 4 years, and like the stories are amazing. I mean, TV does such a good job of these like packages about the athletes. I still think it's great that no one has come anywhere near to Usain Bolt's 100-meter time. That like even like the best dude was like 0.3 of a second off. I mean, the female athletes this year were incredible. The gal that ran the 400 hurdles,
Sydney.
Oh my
McLaughlin.
God!
Yeah.
What's crazy now too? Every one of those girls is not only the best at the top of her sport, but could easily go take a shower and go walk on a runway and be a fucking multi-million-dollar supermodel. Like I was watching it and I was like, oh my God, like every one of Anna, the girl who was the heptathlete, another one.
Anna Hall.
Oh, Anna Hall. I mean, like it was crazy. Like every one of these girls that like they were coming out, I was like, wait a minute, where every one of these girls looks like a supermodel now, like the sprint girls from Holland. I mean, it was cool to see this kind of blending of like athletic performance and aesthetics, and just for some reason these rock star girls are the world's best athletes, and also like just complete dime pieces.
I think that goes back, that's because they're actually being trained. Like think about, this is like probably the first group of women being trained from like the time they were in, let's say 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. It was normal for them to be exposed to resistance-based training, so they don't have to go on the gas to accomplish what they're doing. And then you look at it and it's like, okay, so now we're getting, it's like this in shot put. It's like, there's really going to be over the next like 10 years, the women's shot world record probably will eventually go down. And it was done by a woman on tons and tons of drugs, but it'll go down because there's girls growing up today that are lifting weights and spinning from day one, and it's normal. And I think that that's like one of those things that you'll see with the Olympics now is like across all events, we're training women the way we've always trained men, instead of being like, oh, well, they're just, they shouldn't be squatting, or they shouldn't be cleaning, or they shouldn't be doing whatever exercise. Like they shouldn't be pole vaulting until they're 18 years old. Like what? Why? And now you're seeing like those results of that, not early specialization, but early exposure to that sport. Like in Sydney's case, I almost broke her ankle, by the way, at the Olympics. So I almost entirely ruined the entire Olympic event by breaking Sydney McLaughlin's ankle, but it didn't happen, so it's good.
Dude, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there was this idea for so long that, like late exposure for the girls, but it's fascinating to see. I mean, like the male athletes, like if you look at like the trend over time with the male athletes, and I think somebody did this analysis when they were looking at like the 100 meters from like 100 years ago to this. And when you
marathon too.
Yeah, marathon.
I've seen it.
Yeah, like when you remove the surface, you remove the shoes, you remove all the extra stuff, like it hasn't improved that much. So, and then you saw Usain Bolt's deal, but he was unique. I mean, 6'6", and what's hilarious is, and I got 2 questions for you. One, somebody asked me if I thought Usain Bolt was athletic, and because I don't view sprinting in a straight line as athletic. And I thought it was a funny statement. So I got online and I found a YouTube video of him playing soccer. And he was incredible. I mean, dude was killing people. He was like jumping around and moving in space. And so it was just kind of one of our models is like, running in a straight line is a great show of power and strength and, eccentrics, and you go through all these different pieces. But is it a sign of athleticism? It is when you put a fucking hurdle in their way and they got to get over it. It's athletic. But
fair, yes, 100%.
But the other one, I was last weekend. I was in Atlanta. We were doing some due diligence on a company for a client, and I was sitting there with a guy who's a current Navy SEAL, like really into training, and we were just rapping. And he asked me what I thought that the greatest display of athleticism was, and in the Olympics. And I believe it's the pole vault.
I was gonna So I think you have to define it. I think the downfall of the vault is there's no endurance component. So that's a downfall. But if you look at
I've seen a lot
speed,
of unathletic people that can just fucking grind.
yes, that's fair. So
Yeah.
so if you look at speed, strength, explosiveness, and endurance, I think those are really the only four things that go into training anybody. And
Well,
like you just
like
basically have to like
precision. I would throw precision in there for the fact
Mhm.
that like you think about throwing the shot put, like the precision and the spatial awareness to be able to move within the ring and be like, offensive line play, right? So I set up in my spatial awareness to be able to move in space in relation to another individual and be able to like move my
to
body to
dial
be
in
able
where their hand's
yeah.
going to go, you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, but I mean,
I
like
would,
the shot
I would,
put, javelin, all of these things are all kind of like moving in space in relationship to either a line or an implement to be able to express yourself.
yeah.
You know,
The vault is crazy because you're you're literally so it's funny because you brought this up and Mondo he raced the 400-meter world record holder yesterday. He ran
yeah,
like a 10:37.
dude. This is
And then
why I'm bringing this up because I just watched this thing.
yeah, and
Yeah,
then you think about I said okay, I want to see what's his long jump because he probably could long jump like 25 feet, which is really good.
yeah.
And then you're looking at he's upside down. So now you're thinking about the coordination there. And like, don't get me wrong, gymnastics I would throw in there as well because I think that and I wanted to say when I was saying endurance and strength and explosiveness and speed, I think of those in the weight room that we can do in the weight room. I think precision is more so the specific work that you would do on the field
Yes.
or in like a technical drill. But I think
Well, that would be like the GPP training phase, everything within the confines of a gym.
Yeah,
and then,
yeah, you're right.
that's why one of my huge fucking pet peeves, which is like a fucking dagger in my forehead, is when people talk about doing sports specific training in the weight room.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like,
yeah.
I was like, like this has been, and I drive by and there's these little gyms all around. We're like, oh, sports specific training for kids. And they're having them run ladders and shit. And I'm like, dude, it's GPP.
Stop.
It's all GPP unless you're actually executing your sport. Like it seems like a simple model, and I don't know why people fuck it up so bad. But the precision aspect, I mean, like I guess like the precision in terms of a clean and a snatch, and your ability to jerk weight overhead and pull a bar tight to the body, and the timing to get underneath it. I mean, now you're talking about somewhat or plyometrics to be able to jump up on a box or jump over a box, or the precision to not fucking kill yourself or rack your shins. So I've seen a lot of unathletic. That was one of my people like, oh, how do you know people are athletic? I'm like, easy, jump up on a box. You can't do it slow. And do you have
and then land off?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean,
It's
simple. Like, yeah.
How, dude? There's times I'm like, how do you suck at doing this?
Yeah.
This is like shit you should have learned. Like the guys our age, and I'm like, yo, dude, you're 40. Like,
Yeah.
you were just bitching about kids today, like how they don't work, they don't exercise outside. You can't even jump on a damn box, dude. What were you doing?
I had a conversation, like I was at ADCC a couple weeks ago on the CGI thing, and I told the story on the podcast recently, but this guy kind of approached me, listened to the podcast, and we were kind of talking. And I told the guy, I was like, I find it really fascinating that there's a lot of guys that come to jiu-jitsu, late 30s, early 40s, and this is their first athletic endeavor. Like they didn't compete in anything. They were young. They weren't necessarily high athletes. And then they find jiu-jitsu and they kind of fall in love and they want to compete. And while I am forever a champion of anybody that wants to compete at anything, and I love the dedication and the training, like it's fucking great. I'm just always amazed that like they got to the party so late. Like I'm glad that it's like the 30 or 40-year-old like CrossFitter or Olympic lifter. I've never Olympic lifted. And then in my 30s, I'm going to become obsessed with it and want to compete at Olympic lifting. And you're like, dude, the metabolic pathways and the strength and all this stuff to be really kind of competitive at these advanced years, which is past literally the prime. If you go look at all the Russian, training manuals, started when we were kids. Like I started training when I was 6. And, like my peak deal was from probably, 18 in college till I was, 32 in the NFL. Like those were my peak years, I squatted 610 when I was 19 and benched 500 when I was 22. I mean, like if I'm telling you at 40, closer to 50 than I am to 40, that like I'm the fittest I've ever been and the strongest I've ever been, that's amazing. But what the fuck were you doing in your 20s and 30s? And so that was the kind of the comment I made to the guy. I was like, man, I love it, but like, it's interesting to me. It's fascinating that people find this, they get bit so late in life when they're kind of technically past their prime.
And then they join a sport where they're going to get their ass beat.
Well, I mean, the jiu-jitsu stuff's pretty interesting, just because like you can do it and not really get your ass beat if you pick the right partners, or maybe, you want to flow and roll and shit. But like the guys, I train a guy named Victor Hugo and Philippe Costa, and like, Philippe finished third, won the bronze in the 88 for ADCC, and Victor's one of the top guys, even though he had a little bit of a stumble at CGI. But rolling with those guys, I mean, they're 24, 26 years old. They've been doing this since they were like 6 years old. They're absolute fucking killers. Like I always joke that like I go in there and I feel like everything I wanted to do, I wasn't able to do, and I don't know what to do with my hands. I'll be like, I thought I knew I had a plan, and then they just smash you. So it's just fascinating. And so I told the guy this, I'm like, I just like, as a pro athlete, and I know I live in an ivory tower, and but like I find that, and then the guy basically made some post on the internet about how I was shit talking people. I'm like, I wasn't shit talking people. I was just describing that from my ivory tower. It's kind of like when you watch the Olympics, right? Like I don't think anybody watches the Olympics and at 30 years old is like, I'm going to go out there and be a gymnast and I want to train like Simone Biles.
Yeah.
Right. Like I look at it and I think, yeah, I like most of these girls are between 12 and 14. I think this is the first Olympics we've ever had where the girls are on like the other side of 16. Like they were showing like, all the best gymnasts in the world. These girls have like like 12 to 16. That's why they all like go to the Olympics, and then at 18 they apply and go to college, and then they compete in college, for their team, and they get a scholarship in the NIL deal now. But like you'll even hear the girls that are in college be like, "Oh no, my best gymnastics was 4 or 5 years ago. I'm just doing this for the scholarship." And so it's wild now that like the girls are a little bit older, like, and this was the first time we'd seen kind of older girls. I mean, what's Simone Biles? She's in her mid-20s, which is like might as well be 400 years old.
So I think, she was 26. The Brazilian girl was like 25. She might even be 27 now. And I think there was 2 other girls that were like 23. And I remember them talking about this. Like I don't know if it's the complexity of the movements has gotten them to have this longevity, because they keep trying things that are harder and harder and harder. So you have to have more time to develop that, and the strength component to achieve those much more technical movements. But it still goes back to, you watch Simone Biles. I mean, there's that video of her throwing out like the first pitch at an Astros game.
Yeah.
She does like a standing backflip with a twist in her jeans.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like, you just know you have more clear appreciation, whereas guys see, and I think maybe this is the other thing. Maybe when you see like freestyle wrestling and you see their ears and you see how banged up they can get when they come off the mat, and they're wearing, I think this might be part of my theory, is like they're wearing a singlet as well. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, even though, you can wear no-gi, which is basically, the rash guard, and it's less exposing, I guess. And maybe that's part of the entry into it, is like the jiu-jitsu entryway is a lower barrier than going into freestyle wrestling or something like that. And there's less appreciation for the skill that goes into jiu-jitsu. I don't know. That was what I was thinking.
All you have to do is wrestle with actually a legitimate wrestler. So my training partner, Matt, he wrestled at Cornell Power 5, played football there, but was their heavyweight. First time I wrestled with him, I was like, because I didn't wrestle, I played football. And they were always so nervous that we were going to lose weight. So they kind of like kept us from it. So I did track. I had early visions when I was young of being running the 110 hurdles. And then the problem was I would go out there and I'd run. And then as I got like, 165, 200, 225, 250, the coach was like, dude, you're too big to run the hurdles, but you can still train with us. Right. And I think that was how I always kept my speed. But I think anybody who has any visions of grandeur should go out and legitimately roll with like either, a world champ, like, Victor or Philippe, or go wrestle with a legit Power 5 fucking wrestler. I had like, after doing that, I was like, man, I would really have to like train twice a day, 10 days, like 7 days a week for the rest, like for for a decade to be good enough to be able to do this. Like Matt just fucking was killing people. And he's like, 38-year-old dad, bond trader, and is like, oh yeah, no, I wrestled in this. And like, we went up to Tim Kennedy was teaching a wrestling thing for the guys, and Matt and I just came in, and like to the point where like Tim came over and was like, yeah, clapped his hands and went away. Cause he's like, this dude's like 275 fucking just murdering people. It's but it's really like I watched Ryan Krauser, who fucking such a beast. I mean, I was watching his training stuff. I mean, the dude's basically doing these like clean high pulls with like 440 pounds like they're nothing, and like you could see the training environment and why he's throwing, but he's also huge. It's just like watching Lasha at the in the Olympic lifting. I mean, what's he like, 6'9", 400 and some pounds? I mean,
he's just incredibly big.
Yeah, and moves so fucking graceful. Like, I've always thought Olympic lifting was a really shitty way to develop strength and power, but it was a great way to, like, if you were strong and pretty athletic, to be able to like demonstrate strength and power. So I get into this with a lot of people. Like, there are very few NFL players and the top athletes you see really Olympic lift, and if they do, it's maybe the power variations, right? Like power clean, power snatch, pulls, longer pulls, but there was, I think from the CrossFit deal, there was this idea that somehow Olympic lifting unlocked athleticism, and I just didn't see it. I mean, I always thought like the pulls were important, but the plyos, the jumps, I mean, it was all the other things, not just snatch, clean and jerk, snatch, clean and jerk. It was a concurrent training model developed this. But then when you watch Lasha, you're like, okay, that dude fucking moves. That guy could go play in the NFL and absolutely fucking dominate people.
I've always wondered that. What if he would play? Like, I mean, that obviously he's older now and it's different, but it's like, I mean, Joe Kovacs is like that. I'm like, what if Joe Kovacs was playing like D tackle or nose or something? Like, dudes, and he's got long arms. It's like, it's crazy. I wanted to bring this up. I used to throw, so I threw at Penn State, and when I was in college, Joe Thomas was throwing at Wisconsin, and I was always like, okay, so Joe threw like 1940 or so, and I'm like, would Joe be as good as Ryan is and Joe Kovacs are, with Joe Thomas? Or are we slowly getting to this point now where, like, yes, for sure, the 100% best athletes in the world are in the NFL, and I would argue there's some events like probably the discus, we could pull a lot of basketball players and NFL guys, and we would see an increase in the world record. But I don't know if Joe Thomas, had he just kept throwing, that would be my experiment, would be like, if Joe would have kept throwing, would he have developed to be better than Ryan Krauser is today? That's like a really interesting conversation.
I look at Ryan Krauser, and all I joke, and I've told Bert Soren this joke, like, all these thrower guys I've met, they just remind me of dudes whose mom wouldn't sign the permission slip. Right, because like,
you're not playing football.
Yeah, because when I with Krauser, I'm like, he's a big fucking dude. That guy would be a hell of an offensive lineman. I mean, I played with Steve Neal, who was fucking insane wrestler. So he went to the Patriots, when he ended up, I think, missing the Olympics, and we signed him off from the Patriots because he got cut, and we brought him to our practice squad at the Eagles. And I'm from California. Yeah, well, I'm from California. He's from California, so we just kind of became friends. And I would go out there and help him a little bit and teach him, and be like, "Hey, this is how you play offensive line." And he's like, "How about I just like stand up and kind of fucking grab the guy and wrestle him?" And I'm like, "Hey, dude, if it ain't broke, don't fix it." So then somebody got hurt, and they signed him back to the roster, and he went and started and had a great career. I mean, zero fucking technique, but he understood leverages and how to get his fucking hands on people, and he was gorilla strong and tough as fucking nails. Like, like he had intangibles that like there was no technique to teach. He just fucking out there gorillaing people, and it was impressive. And I was like, man, this guy's a beast. But there are a lot of these guys, and that was my joke with Bert and them. I'm like, dude, all these guys are beasts, man. They just remind me of cats that mom wouldn't sign the permission slip. And the other thing too is playing football. And I'm sure I would imagine you played, and then and then obviously went on and threw at Penn State. What years were you there?
I graduated in 2007.
Okay.
And I was going to say this about Kovacs is like,
he's a big fucking dude. He's he fucking big barrel chest. He's huge.
Exactly. And that's where it's like, I don't want to compare myself to, he went to Penn State as well. I don't want to say, I am not as gifted as he is. He actually, I was his host when we brought him in. So when I graduated, he came in. But I think the downfall with someone like Joe, and I'm not saying I'm like Joe, but myself, was like, we were 1AA recruits. So it was like, I would have went to Lehigh or Penn or Villanova, someplace like that. So then when you have a Power 5 recruiting you for track, it's like, wow, I'm just going to go to the Power 5.
Sure.
And I think like maybe that hindered someone like Joe, who sort of blossomed by like his junior year. That's when he really, really blew up in track. And I'm wondering, like, what would that have turned into in the football realm? You know, I don't know.
Like if he was just kind of a late bloomer.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, the interesting thing is, I was kind of a late bloomer. I know it sounds crazy, but I grew 2 inches in college. So I was like 6'4", maybe like 250, which I know is wild. I looked like paper skinny. But when I showed up at college, I didn't own a razor. I remember my roommate's like, "Do you have a razor?" I'm like, "No, I've never fucking never shaved." Like these dudes all had like full hairy chests and stuff. And I'm like, like don't own a razor. And it wasn't until I was probably 21 that all of a sudden, like I started to get facial hair and started kind of like just kind of matured a little bit. And, the first day I was in college, they measured me at like 6'4". When the NFL came back, I was just a hair under 6'6". And they were "Dude, you grew like 2 inches." And I'm like, "Yeah." And then I went from like 250 pounds and now all of a sudden I'm 300 plus pounds. So in those 3 years, I had gained, close to like 50 pounds and grew 2 inches. And, was always real strong, but like, my strength numbers and the maturity, when I was 26 and 28 was like remarkably different. And a lot of the kids that have a ton of success, early on, maybe they're just, get their growth a little bit early, and they, maybe they're like, at 18 or 19, what I was at maybe 24 or 25. And, that's, both my brothers were late bloomers, kind of a deal. And I just wonder for kids like that, because things are, the landscape of pro sport college sports.
They adapt earlier to that size.
Yeah.
So it's like looking at Joe Thomas. So this dude's 6'9", 6'8" when he's 17. I remember throwing against him in high school and being like, "This guy's huge."
How tall is Joe? I mean, we had him on the podcast.
7,
yeah, he's
7.
Tall. Yeah, he's tall, dude.
And like, I remember thinking at that time, okay, if this dude's 6'7" when he's 17, he's like, that's like enormous to like, and he's moving like a savage. So looking back now, it's also like, okay, if arguably one of the greatest left tackles ever.
No. You
don't think like a top 5?
No, even though he's in the Hall of Fame. I'm not shitting on him for the fact that I like him. He never played
top
against
10.
He didn't play against anybody. His team never made the playoffs. And for me, he's probably in that conversation, but the problem is he never really played against anybody on their greatest day. He never played in those real big games. And I think
that's fair. Yeah.
And that's not shitting on him. That's just, he didn't get the chance because he played for the fucking Browns. Right.
Yeah.
And he was done in December every year. So he never had a playoff game.
so he could recover.
So he had plenty of recovering, and he was like, we even had him on the podcast. So when I played, my goal was to catch every single guy on his best day. I wanted to play on the biggest stage against the best player having his best performance. Joe was the exact opposite. He was hoping to catch everybody on their worst day because they were coming to play the Browns. And he's like, "That's how I made my entire career." And dude, it was fucking hilarious. I don't know if it's in that podcast we did with him, but I think offline we were talking about it. And I was like, I wanted to measure myself against the best every opportunity. And he's like, nope. I wanted to be done by December, and fucking like, it was just, and
that's hilarious.
He got to the Hall of Fame. I didn't. So he's obviously fucking way better than me, even though the Hall of Fame is very political. But he had a great career. He did everything he was supposed to. And he's a good fucking dude. But
using the argument,
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if I'd put him in my top 10 though.
Okay. So he was still developing his technical patterning when he's as in his grown ass man size when he was 17, 18 years old. And I
Yeah.
think that is what a lot of late bloomers lack, is like they don't, you're learning the levers, and then you might grow another inch, and then you learn the new levers, and then you grow another inch. So you're
Yep.
not, the neural pathway or the myelin sheathing is slightly different
Yep.
over the span of 5 years, whereas his was more imprinted earlier. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, no, it's this goes back to basic physiology, and I'll tell you a fucking little story. But when I was in middle school, I grew like 3 inches one summer, and so the year before, like every Friday we had to do a timed run, and that was what we got our grade on for PE. So I always had A's. I was always pretty fast. All of a sudden, I grow one summer, and I come back, and I'm like fucking dead last in these runs. To the point where I told the teacher, I was like, I can't go home with a C or a D in PE. My mom will literally torch me. And the lady was like, well, we have makeup runs on Friday. If you can just come run, and I'll just give you extra credit and average it in, you'll get a better grade. And I was like, great. So I lied to my mom and was like, hey, I got to do some study after school on Friday. Can you pick me up a little late? So I would do these extra runs. And I remember telling like the teacher and being like, I was fast and now I'm slow. And she was like, well, when you get to high school and you play football and start lifting weights, it'll fix itself. And she said that. And then obviously I went to high school. I was so excited to play football because I wanted to lift weights for a bunch of other reasons, because I always wanted to be big and jacked, and like I wasn't. And I started lifting weights, and all of a sudden, as I got stronger, all of a sudden my speed came back. And so, obviously, years later, after you study all this stuff and you figure out like inter and intermuscular coordination and rate coding and all the other shit that comes about it, that there is this symbiotic relationship for strength, that as you develop strength, you become like this more efficient organism, and everything kind of wires up. And like that inter and intermuscular coordination is like so paramount for sprinting and running. And like, the minute I started lifting weights, as I got strong real quick, and it was like somebody turned the speed back on. And I remember thinking, like, my middle school PE teacher, who was a chick, like, just imagine, like, fucking flat top, big hoop earrings, wearing a tracksuit.
That's my mom. That was my mom.
Okay, this was
literally
like standard 80s,
you
late
just
80s.
Her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Standard. I can't remember her name for the life of me, but like late 80s, early 90s, wearing like a tracksuit, big hoop earrings, and she had like a blonde flat top, like flat top, bleach blonde hair. Like I think we would call those like, she might. I don't know if she was a lesbian or not, but like she was, she was probably married, and that was just the fucking standard outfit for
now this isn't with my mom, but that was the cover up.
Yeah. Like now I think about it, I'm like, she probably was married. Like I don't know. We just didn't know, but like that was
There's
like
a stereotype.
Yeah, no, she was like, this was our PE teacher, right? And like I laugh now where you'll see like periodically people will be like, 80s PE teacher. I'm like, yep, that was her, like flat top, spiky hair, and
she got it,
dude. The fact that she knew it, and when I asked her, and I remember being like, "Oh, like really?" And she's like, "Yeah, I've seen this 100 times." And so she had worked at the school, and all these, pretty good football players had come through, and she was like, mentioned she didn't know my brothers because they were for some reason maybe different school, but she like mentioned like 2 or 3 guys that were like pretty good at the high school. And she's like, Brandon Himmelwright and all these guys that came through, they were all like similar things. I've seen this happen over and over again, where all of a sudden a kid who's pretty fast grows a bunch, and then he's slow, and then he goes and becomes a pretty good football player later on. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, I got to lift weights. And now I know the physiology.
So why is this she's right, like, but let's just say, I don't know, late 80s, early 90s, right? Like why, or early mid 90s, why is it so hard to understand that? Like, why do we have people right now? I literally was scroll braining before I got on, and I'm like, this guy's, oh, young athletes, if you're struggling to jump higher, you need to do XYZ, and he's measuring all this shit. I'm like, yeah, if I got a kid who's 15 years old and he's struggling to jump higher, like I'm just gonna have him squat more. Yeah. Like, well, we don't need to like dude, go get your back squat from 225 to 405. Guess what's gonna happen? Like, why is it so hard for people to understand. Like this chick.
I think it's complexity, right? So I've come to the conclusion that in today's age, that whether it be, like training programs, whatever, the more complexity I can draw around something, the more that I become the gatekeeper. Like I really view hypertrophy like this now. I was so when you read like Zadaskorsky and Science and Practice and that, they always got into different mechanisms. Like there was multiple mechanisms for hypertrophy. It was like, I think it was like metabolic distress and this, and they went through a few different things. Over the course of like a number of years, like the researchers kind of pared it down and figured that like, mechanical tension and mechanical overload, right? Like are drivers for hypertrophy, right? But like the heavier the weight, the bigger a margin of error. Like for example, if you back squat 500 pounds and I squat like, 450 for, let's say 5 reps, and I really could do it for 6 or 7, hypertrophy is going to happen because I'm pretty close. But if you squat 500 and I squat 135 for as many reps as I can, and I can do 30 or 50, I have to legitimately go to the point where I can't stand up anymore, because like the lighter the weight, the more I have to just go to complete fucking burn your house to the ground. And so what I think the problem is then also people don't understand tension. But then again, like those are people that are just training for hypertrophy. Like what we said earlier in the podcast, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So like how does strength and all these other pieces fit in? And so it's so fascinating to me that people on the internet now are obsessed with this idea of hypertrophy. Whereas I always felt that like muscle was like the window dressing for my strength. Like I barely saw dudes that were real strong that weren't jacked. I never saw a dude that had like a monster bench that didn't have big triceps. So like I just thought that these were like the receipts you get from lifting heavy weights. And then now people are trying to like, because this is what the internet's about, right? And whether it be technology, whatever, everybody's looking for a hack and a shortcut, because that's like, the lean model, right? Like 10 years ago, it took you X amount of time to design a website. Now 10 years later with AI and all this other shit, you can build it in fucking real time. So I think that same mentality is happening for people where they're trying to like, well, if, Gabrielle Lyon's talking about muscle centric this, and, my buddy Paul Carter is, become the sheriff. He's become the Lane Norton of hypertrophy. And all he's doing is, there's a lot of bullshit out there, and he's just trying to be like, hey, in a very prickly kind of way. Cause if you know Paul, he's really good at that. The hypertrophy.
What's his name? Paul what?
Paul Carter. Paul is Lift Run Bang. So Paul's a buddy of mine, and he's hilarious, but he's, very big on the research, and, there's bullshit and there's not, and he's kind of prickly, almost like Lane with it. But as we get into it, like there isn't a lot of argument anymore on it, but yet I don't understand the idea of like, hey, I want to train for hypertrophy. Well, all the big dudes that I saw that were real jacked were also real strong. So why don't you just train to be as strong as possible, and hypertrophy happens on the road to strength more so than just focusing on that. But this is a situation, and I think what happens, especially with like the hypertrophy game, and even we see it in like sport performance, you can go back and look at Charlie Francis. So I was very fortunate when I came in the NFL in '99 as a rookie. I ruptured my patellar tendon, and Mauro De Pasquale, who was the doc that ended up doing all my supplements and stuff, put me in touch with Charlie. I got on the phone and we talked about EMS protocols and training, and I got a fairly good dose of him. But if you still pull up Charlie's stuff, I mean, it's still completely relevant and the best thing out there, but yet people will add these high amounts of complexity to sprint training, where it's Charlie's deal is either you're running as fast as you can, because the only way you get fast is to run fast, or you're doing some form of tempo technique recovery runs and building GPP. And he liked, dissimilar movements. Like I would much rather have you do med balls and do all these other things to develop your GPP, because it's not overloading the pattern that we need to be most efficient at. Like it's so clean and so simple, but yet if you look at everybody who's adding these levels of complexity, it's so they can kind of put themselves up and be like, I'm the expert because I understand this silo and you have to come to me for this. Strength training is the same way. You look at, everybody creating these like silos. I mean, there's dudes that have like, like I did a talk for Sornex, and there was a guy there, Judd, who's got a, Instagram page with 500,000 followers. And all he does is find incredibly complex, different ways to do the same basic movements. I'm like, I've seen this guy do 25 different versions of like what I would do with just like a bent over barbell row or a one arm dumbbell row. And he's found like 400 different ways to do it, to the point where I was like, man, this is really good content, but like there's way better ways to do this that don't look like any of this. But that's what people are looking for. Oh, this is the reason I'm not jacked. So if I add this, this, and this, now this will be able to hit this and this. I'm like, no, it's fucking position. You got to get your elbow tight to your fucking rib cage to be able to use your lat. So I think it's the complexity thing on the internet that people are looking for differentiation. So by adding complexity to it and a fancy name, they can effectively silo themselves out and say, I'm the expert. I'm the only one that knows. Come to me, come to the mountain.
Yeah. And it's funny because even when you just started that, I was like immediately thinking about Ronnie Coleman. I'm like, this dude was a world-class powerlifter before he got into bodybuilding. It's like, well, what did he do? He might have changed his training very slightly and taken a little bit more drugs, probably a bit more drugs, but like he was already like, he was ungodly strong. So like that's it. Just the only thing that I was thinking that is slightly interesting in the sense that, and I do think that this is the one thing that the complexity does create interest in the sense of like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Some of the stuff that Lane Norton has actually talked about is he's like, some of the mechanisms are interesting because they think like, okay, let's say the cell expands and now there might be myofibrillar hypertrophy myofibers might be built in this larger cell caused by sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So like the interesting part of the physiology can make it complex, but it still doesn't discount if you freaking get really strong and you're under tension a lot, you're still going to get bigger. So it doesn't change your training. It's just the interest of understanding the physiology on something so like the minutia of that is fun to comprehend. And then what happens on top of what you were saying with the bent over row guy is like, then someone masters like the physiology of what is actually might be happening that we are just trying to learn now. And then they're the hypertrophy guru, when all reality, it's like, it still doesn't change your training.
Yeah.
Get strong, get a pump, do it all over again, do jumps, run sprints. You're going to be good.
Yeah.
Like,
no, I mean, I made the observation years ago that I could look at pro football players with their shirts off and I could tell you who lifted weights over 85% and who didn't. Like there was a remarkable difference in just the structure and the framework and like the physical appearance of the muscle, like the trap and the arm and like everything. Like I could tell you who lifted heavy weights and who didn't.
Were they more dense?
Yeah, just more dense, more inertia, heavier hands. They're like, the traps, which are, I always felt that everybody's obsessed with neck training for avoiding neck injuries and a lot of the, things that plague guys that beat their head into a wall for a fucking living. I always felt it was the traps. And like the rhomboids and like the back, like these muscles become the buttresses for the neck. And I felt like big traps. And like, there's like the upper trap and the lower trap. And a lot of the shrugs are for the lower trap. And more like when you get into like the Kelsos or the incline dumbbell shrugs, like that's where you really hit that upper trap. So I did a lot of like dips and a lot of trap work because the old power lifter that trained me, that was a big piece. He's like, dude, you need to have traps that are coming out of your ears if you want to be able to hit hard and survive. And he had trained football, like he was a power lifter, but he had trained a lot of high school kids over the years that had come in. And he's like, the guys that had big traps did not have neck injuries and they seemed to hit harder. So we would do like a lot of reverse shrugs on the dip bars and just a lot of different angles of pulls and shrugs. So the guys that lifted heavy weights just had a remarkable difference. They just looked different, and you could see them with their shirts off and be like, that dude's pretty strong. Like, I know that guy lifts weights. And then you go in the gym and you'd be like, yeah, no, story checks out. And, there were a lot of guys that the only way they weren't getting the NFL is if they got hit on a bus to the signing day. So, I mean, like, they were just genetic freaks. And there were guys that like, not to say that this was 100% one way. I mean, sometimes you see a dude and like Willie Rofe was a great example. Like Willie would be in my hall, like on the Mount Rushmore for offense for left tackles. Willie was really fucking strong and really fast. And when you saw him walk, you thought that like this old man was like days away from a disc replacement, knee and hip and whatever. And then all of a sudden you got him in his stance and the ball snapped and he moved like I've never seen, but he moved. To the point where I was like, is this guy fucking spoofing us? He's like moving like an old man. He would kind of like hobble and this and get down his stance and they'd snap the ball and he would move like lightning. we went in the weight room and lifted weights, and I watched him, put 430 on the bar and throw it around, and it was like it was nothing, to the point where I was like, fuck, he didn't even warm up. He just put it on, pop, 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 and threw it off. And I was like, oh yeah, he's real fucking strong. Brian Waters, another guy I played with, was insanely strong. So just observationally, and then you play with guys and you feel the punch in the hands and this, and like, who's a motherfucker and who's not pretty quickly. And, it wasn't 100%, but for the most part, you could kind of see the reflection in the weight room. Like, oh, that dude trained. Those guys came from a university that had a huge training philosophy. Like, Penn State wasn't necessarily offensive lineman. Like, even though I work with Will Fries, who's a Penn State guy, plays for the Colts. He's come and trained. But when I was in the league, I mean, Penn State guys were hit dudes, 1 set to 1 and failure on hammer strength.
Yeah, it was bad. It was really bad up until 2010, 2012. It was terrible.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I played with Larry Johnson, who, Penn Stater. But yeah, I mean, the training that those guys did, I mean, they didn't lift heavy barbells. Like, you look at like the Nebraska guys, all those dudes were big and strong coming out of that program. They all could move and run and jump. I mean, so I took a trip to Nebraska when I was a senior in high school in 94. And that was the pinnacle of Nebraska. I mean, like Brandon Stye and Joel Wilkes and Zanika. I mean, like, I went out with these guys, dude, and they were like gods in the town. They were all fucking 300 plus pounds with all like damn near 500 pound benches. Like, every one of these dudes was a monster, to the point where I was like, fuck, dude, this is like a professional offensive line. And they won a national championship and were killing people. And, but they all trained, they all lift heavy weights. They did plyos, they jumped, they threw, they did, a ton of rotational work. I mean, we had Boyd Epley on the podcast, and yeah, I mean, it's like human evolution hasn't gone that far. I mean, if you look at men, we're probably relatively the same in the last 40 to 100,000 years. Like, the only thing that's happened, we're dealing with the same hardware, the same emotional software. We just have more tech at us, but at the end of the day, it's still the same organism.
The same. I wanted to ask you, I've noticed this with Willie Roaf. I noticed this in throwers and super explosive athletes that come into the gym, like kids. They come in and they're like, they move like how you described Willie Roaf, like super slow, methodical. And then all of a sudden it's just like, boom. When they start training or something, it's like, what? Where was this? Like, it took you 25 minutes to go from the front of the gym to the bathroom and back. And then you go in and you're back squatting 500 pounds and it's a 16-year-old kid. It's like, I have this theory that like guys like that are just super wired, they move so slowly because they're so good at using a massive amount of energy that like they sort of look like they're in slow motion because their body's using so much less energy because they get so fatigued from doing their explosive movement pattern that I when you were saying that, I was thinking about that thought, because there's a lot of throwers where you're like, how is this dude a savage? He looks like a turd, and then all of a sudden it's just like they take one. It's like, what the fuck? How did that happen? I didn't know if you'd ever noticed that with more than just him.
My wife has accused me of this quite often, because my wife is like the Energizer Bunny. She never stops. She never sits down. She just moves all the time. And so we were talking about like NEAT, like non-exercise energy expenditure deal. Yeah, so her NEAT, like she will never be obese. Like she just moves too much. I've never seen anybody move more than her, to the point where like she eats standing up. And like, even if we're watching like TV, like I'll sit down, she like is still moving.
She's like pacing back and forth. Yeah.
It's like, she's like, like I have a dog. So my one dog likes to chill. My other dog is kind of nervous. And the reason that he's super nervous is because she never stops moving. And the only time he'll chill is if she's like not in the room and it's me, he'll like sit down. But the minute she's there, he mirrors her. But she made the joke because my daughters were like, "Mom, you never stop moving." Like, and she's like, "Your dad is really good at resting. Like when it's time to work, it's time to work. And when it's not, we're going to like, and maybe that's an offensive line thing where like, we're going to bust ass, but like, if we're not busting ass, then it's recovery time and we're not going to move excess." And I think maybe that's just coming from like being a big person over 300 pounds where you sweat real easy, where you're like, I'm just going to hang out and not move so I don't get real sweaty. But then when it's time to move, we're fucking going to do a lot. I because if you look at like lions and like they chill until it's not time to chill, and then they go. So maybe it's more like lions rather than and this goes back to a conversation I hadn't thought about it in years, but years ago I went to breakfast with Dr. Nicholas Romanov, the guy that invented pose, Russian sports scientist, and I was kind of asking him a little bit about like how do you program, like how do you skew volume and intensity for athletes? Because I've met some athletes that can handle volume. I've met other athletes that can handle intensity. I've met very few athletes that can handle both. And I'll just give you an example. So my roommate in college is a guy named Kevin Doherty. Doe, if you're listening to this, what's up? And Doe was real strong in high school, like benched 400 pounds, squatted 600. They trained 3 days a week. They did a bench day, accessory, squat day, accessory with accessory, and then a pull deadlift day, accessory. And they trained 3 days a week. Had like he was monster. Comes to college, and naturally, because of the way universities are and football, it's kind of like fucking go. So now all of a sudden we're training 6 days a week. And, we're doing this and, we're, 6 in the morning, plyometrics, running, jumping, coming back. Practice. It's just fucking high volume. And every single day he was at college, he got weaker. So he came in, he benched 400. I don't think he benched 300 pounds by the time we left. And like the coach used to get on him, Doe, what the fuck is wrong with you? And even appoint him, I was like, what's like, why are you getting weaker? And he's like, it's too much work. Like when I trained 3 days a day, three times a week, I was strong as shit. Like once every 7 days for each movement was fine for me. And like, I'm kind of a big monkey where I'm like, fuck dude, like whatever you want to do, I can go do. And so I got better from more volume. He got worse. And so when I talked to Dr. Romanoff, he was kind of talking about this idea of volume and intensity. And he's like, sports like football, especially offensive, defensive line, naturally select for what he called big monkeys, or people that can handle a lot of volume and intensity and just a lot. There's other sports like quarterback. I played with, Tom Brady had a dude out with a clicker who counted every single reps, and Tom only got X amount of reps in that week because that was all he could throw to be able to be good on Sunday. And whereas you look at like Patrick Mahomes, I guarantee they don't have a clicker on him. He could probably throw 500 passes in the course of a week. Like I think Tom's was like 75 a day is what he could throw, including warm-ups. And to be able to throw 3 days a week and whatever that was, 200 throws, and then he did this. And they monitored his volume and his intensity because they knew he only had so many bullets in the gun. You have a guy like Mahomes who probably fucking throws 100 throws in warm-up and then throws 300 practices, and the guy's fucking just like rubber. And so that kind of big monkey, small monkey. And so when I asked Dr. Romanoff about it, he said years ago, to be a Russian sports scientist and a master, you had to take somebody on their journey and they either win a world championship, a gold medal, or do something of great for you to become a master sports scientist. So they would have to turn in their programs into whoever the, Russian sports scientists, big house. And a lot of people and a lot of athletes would lie about what they were doing, and their coaches would lie because they were technically kind of small monkeys in that they, 3 days a week of training was perfect for them. But but everybody wants more is better. And for these guys, the quality of the movement was more over, and recovery was important. Mm-hmm. So sports like football, especially offensive line, D-line, around the ball, really pre-select for guys that can handle a lot. As you get farther away from the ball, whether it be receivers or this, like you can kind of have these guys in almost like, hey, this guy's really fast for 20 sprints in a game. He can't run 80 fucking plays. So you watch receivers where a guy's a burner, but he doesn't run, like he might do a series, maybe a play or two every series. Like they can have that guy rotate in, and they're like, hey, it's third and long. This guy's got jets, but he's only got so many jets in him. So they do a really good job of monitoring that aside from the position I play. So Doe was a small monkey, and our coach, who was a psychopath, Tom Cable, if you're listening, Tom was just literally just like fucking, axe to the grindstone, whips to the back at all times. And it just broke a lot of people that didn't have that wiring. And then when I got to the NFL, you could see a lot of the guys that had kind of been able to kind of like stumble through it, end up becoming better NFL players because now they're more focused on recovery, and the coaches are more conscious of this stuff because they're paying them big money. And So to go back, when the way Dr. Romanoff explained it is they did a study in Russia where they had they observed monkeys, and they observed some monkeys that only moved enough to eat and were just chilled. And then there was other monkeys that played and fought and battled and just never stopped moving. Well, they put the monkeys that never stopped moving in cages and locked them up for like 23 hours a day. And then they took the monkeys that didn't like to move and made it extremely difficult for them to get their food. Like they had to move and do all these things. And eventually the monkeys that weren't used to moving just laid down and died. And then the other monkeys that were stuck, that couldn't move all the time, had so much energy that when they got out of the cages, they beat each other all to death. And so I'm kind of butchering the story a little bit, but his theory was like, you have to decide with your athletes whether or not they're big monkeys or small monkeys, and you can't jam big monkeys into a small monkey program and vice versa. So as you start realizing that, like, you know, and you write training programs in this, you have to look at recovery. And like you do, I'm sure, like when you coach athletes online and you don't really necessarily see them in person, you got to have these kind of checks and balances. And like, I always get people being like, oh man, I was smoked after this. And they're like, what should I do? I'm like, you're good. If you're smoked, I would much rather, like, try to explain to people, you can't die on the sword each day for each workout. It's the cumulative effect of training that drives adaptation. Like if I miss one rep in the scale, in the realm of 6-8 months, a year, or 3 years, what's one rep? What's one training day? But it's the person that can train with the highest relative intensity over time for the longest period of time is the one that meets their goal. And so people get really stuck in the minutia of like, today I wasn't able to do it. I'm like, that's fine. If you did everything you could today, great. Leave, come back tomorrow. Let's reboot again. And then over the course of time, and opposed from you dying on the sword today and getting injured, or let's say not being able to train for a week, now we haven't necessarily hit our goal. But his that analogy and that talk was extremely impactful for me in terms of being able to kind of like, when you start working with people, be able to like give a little bit of the bell curve and kind of design it here, and then be able to have some levers to pull to go either way. And, you know, and then if people are big monkeys, they'll just naturally select, they'll just do extra. Like, hey, I want to do a little bit more. Dude, go do curls, go do this, do push-ups. I mean, so it's always easy to prescribe more than it is to kind of pull people back, because they always feel like, oh, so-and-so is doing more, so-and-so is getting ahead of me. And, you know, with the JITS thing, those guys are naturally big monkeys just for the fact that it's what they do. You know, they might do 14 to 20 training sessions in a week. At one point, I think we were at like 20 training sessions a week. They were training, you know, 2 to 3 sessions on the mat over the course of 7 days, and then like 3 legit training full body sessions with me. So, I mean, like the amount of volume that they were training, it was insane. And these guys are like rubber. So, you know, are there other people that aren't like this? 100%. And I'm sure there's other guys that are like, I train once a day and I'm a world champion. These guys, this is just what they can do and what they've worked into because they've built those metabolic pathways. It's what they've been doing their whole lives.
Do you think they're more genetically predisposed to that?
Yeah, I think that there's a few factors. I think you obviously have to have the genetic makeup. Like I think you got to have the raw material to start with, but I think a lot of this stuff comes from what you expose your kids early on. That's why if you look at let's say CrossFit, for example, a lot of the girls that are really good at CrossFit did gymnastics when they were young. And if you've ever been to a gymnastics, like a legit gymnastics place, we used to, when I lived in Orange County, we used to go to the Azarian, and the Azarian place is where a bunch of the Olympians are. And the guy was an Olympian. This place was a fucking factory. I took my daughters there, and these girls could have done 25 CrossFit workouts in a day for what I saw them doing. I mean, these girls were there for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. They were doing this conditioning. I mean, it was insane to the point where I'd bring my girls when they were little. We would just sit and watch the big girls train. And I was like, holy shit, dude, this is insane. These girls do this every day. And those girls are like rubber. I mean, they probably retired from gymnastics and went and done CrossFit. And they're like, this is simple. This is all you want me to do? Yeah. So that's why those girls have done so well. But that kind of like for example, when I had Will Fries here, the NFL is different now than when I played. They get 5 padded practices in training camp. And I think it's like maybe 5, 7, maybe it's a little bit more, a little less padded practice over the course of the season. So effectively, including games in a 10-year career for him at that rate, he will have less time in pads than I had as my rookie year in training camp.
Holy crap.
right? I was in training camp 6 weeks, 42 days. We went pads in the morning, pads in the night, pads in the morning, special teams. We did that for 3-hour practices, 9-on-7, one. I mean, we had, like, when we accumulated it up, the amount of hitting that we did in that first training camp in that first season was insane. It's more than he'll ever see. And like when we kind of tallied out the numbers, he's like, fuck, I don't think I would have survived. I'm like, there was a lot of dudes that didn't, and it was a war of attrition. But now that the NFL is becoming so much fun, is that you're able to almost like allow dudes that would have shattered on the rocks to all of a sudden get there. Like there was it was such a war of attrition to get to where you wanted to play, that great players just got shattered and never got a chance to play because they couldn't handle the volume on the front side.
Dude, that's insane. I think when you're describing that, it makes me think about, I've always noticed, let's say you get a kid that grows up in the city and a kid that, like, heart of the city, and then you get a kid who grows up in the farm. And you look at it and you say, okay, these kids have drastically different lives, but the thing that's very similar, let's say the kid that grows up in the city, he goes to the basketball courts and he's playing basketball, baseball, kickball, foursquare from the time it's 8 a.m. till the time it's 8 p.m, basically. Then you have the kid that grows up on the farm, and this kid is doing farm chores, walking around doing X, Y, or Z, basically from 6 a.m. until probably 10 o'clock at night. And both of them, based off of how you were describing, like, I guess they would be the big monkey, is like they're genetically probably substantially different, but their upbringing from an early age is so, their physical tasks are so spread out throughout a day that they can then handle that volume when they turn to the age of 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, because of what they did when they were 6 to 12. They were so ingrained with, like, oh, I gotta go be active and do something for the entire day, go to the pool, go do gainers off the diving board and shit. And even looking at the farm kid, like, they're basically just doing work and chores all day. They're never doing super intense work, but then when they hit puberty, they go through puberty. Now their body's adapted to survive those scenarios, so that then when they do start resistance training and they do start playing, they can handle the volume, versus somebody else who is a little more sedentary early on probably is the smaller monkey. Now, in that case, I'm not saying that the smaller monkey necessarily is like that they're more sedentary at a younger age, but I would imagine that the kids who are more active earlier in life can handle more volume later on.
I completely believe it. I mean, gymnastics, swimming. So what's fascinating about swimming, especially at a young age, the amount of pool time that they're in, and the load, and the fact that they're pulling their body in a different environment against this, kind of resistance of the water, and just the amount of work that they do. My daughter swam pretty competitively, and she ended up kind of developing like this weird reaction to the chlorine, where she was getting sick, and just like there was way too much chlorine in the pool. And so we were like trying to find a different place, but I drop her off and she was there 3 hours. And they were like, 5 days a week. She was in the pool for 3 hours. And then all of a sudden she started getting like these big circles, and we took her to this doctor, and the doctor's like, she could be just sensitive to the chlorine or the chemicals in the pool. And I'm like, really? Is that a thing? And so they're like, well, pull her out of the water 30 days and, we'll see if she's better. They pulled her out 30 days and she was fine. And she's like, oh, so, it's kind of hard for me to be like, get back in the fucking pool, so let's go do something else. But she really loved it. And, now she plays hoops, but I'm always like, man, do you think you get back into swimming? You're real good at it. And she's like, I just felt like so sick in the water. And, it's because they got like, 50 kids in there taking a leak all the time. Nobody's ever getting out. And then they're just basically just fucking dosing her in chlorine. But I think that a lot of those metabolic pathways and a lot of that stuff is established very early in life, and that you set those characteristics. Obviously, probably, man, it'd have to be 6 or 7, 8 years ago. I got reached out to through a doctor buddy that there's a genetic thing that's called Amsterdam New Genomics. And what they kind of do is they do your DNA, and then you pay in a pretty decent sum, and then it's kind of like an annuity in that, like it was a research deal. So we gave our genetics, and then they send me research on the genetics, and they're constantly, anything that hits within my genetic code, I get research. So once a week I get a big dump, and it's kind of I got like my wife done, myself done, my son. I think we did my dad too before he passed away. So the genetic stuff is pretty interesting, and I think everybody thinks like, oh, the genetics. Well, I have a genetic deal that has to do with amylase deficiency. So theoretically, based on my genetics, I have something where any form of physical exercise that's hard will result in like rhabdomyolysis and like CK numbers in the thousands. And so I like to the point where people that have this can't do any physical exercise, even walking causes terrible muscle pain. So I get this thing and I look at it and I call the doc, or I call the researcher in charge, and I'm like, hey, what is this? And he's like, oh shit, you have this. And like, not just like a little bit, but like pretty round circle, like 90%, right? And I tell him like, hey dude, I played in the NFL. I go through this whole thing and like, what gives? And the guy's like, got real quiet. I'm like, what's up? And he's like, just another day of where I've found that genetics don't mean shit. He's like, there are so many tricks and so many like levers and locks above the genetics where there's something higher order that's basically hacking it in. Where, yeah, you might have this genetic thing, but it didn't express for you because of something you've done, or you've done it at bay. Where like, based upon this, if somebody had shown you this at 6 years old, they would have put you
been done.
Yeah, they would have been like, you can't do anything, you're going to die. But like nobody told you this. You just went out and he goes, do you remember like any muscle pain? I'm like, yeah, when we would run, my legs would get real sore. And he's like, what'd you do the next day? I'm like, I don't know. We just went running again. Like it. And he's like, you probably just fucking out-trained it, or there was something higher order. And like, even to this day, like my CK numbers are still elevated higher than what they would want. I think they're anywhere from like let's say it's a 20 to 500. I'm always like just north of 500, a little higher. And, but then they're also like, well, people with higher muscle mass carry a lot of CK numbers. So like when I look at my health stuff, that's like the only kind of like weird piece. But then when we did CrossFit, people were getting rhabdomyolysis and we're getting CK numbers in the thousands. And then the funny part was we trained with a guy who got real bad rhabdo, had to go to the hospital, and they were talking about it. And they were like, oh, when I took a leak, it was like I was pissing root beer. And as he was explaining it to me, I'm like, oh, so we gave ourselves rhabdo every single day at training camp? Right? Because like they were like, oh, your limbs swell. Like as the guy was explaining rhabdo, I'm like, oh,
yeah, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah. Oh, that's what we went through every day at training camp when we were, in college at Cal State Sanderslaus, where it was 110 degrees and we're out there for 3 hours, or, all the shit that we did. I played the hottest game in NFL history. And so we go through this whole thing and I'm like, fuck, we didn't know what that was, but like we legitimately. And so when I was telling the doctor, he's like, you probably have given yourself rhabdo so many times that you're kind of impervious to it. So this is where you get into this stuff where I think as young athletes, you do this training and then all of a sudden, you've never done this training. And then at 30 years old, you go decide to do 100 GHD sit-ups. And next thing you know, you're in the hospital with rhabdo. Whereas people are like, we did the same thing. And I was like, I didn't feel anything.
So the doctor goes, did you ever have this issue when you were younger? What was it like? And you're like, well, when I was like 14, my middle school gym teacher said, just wait till you start lifting, the rhabdo will go away.
Yeah. I mean, I was probably 10 or 12. I mean, it's, I think what a lot of the genetic stuff does, if, genetically, it's pretty hard to play in the NFL if you're not 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", right? Mm-hmm. So being 6'6", like, okay, there's a genetic component there. I also got stronger every time I lifted weights for a long, long time, right? And there's not a lot of people that can carry 300 pounds and carry it fairly well. So there's some genetic kind of adaptation. It's funny, over the years, I've had people be like, hey, I'd love for my kid to play in the NFL. What do you think? And I'm like, looking at the dude, I'm like, do you have like an uncle or maybe like a great uncle, or there's a legend about somebody in your family that used to do
7 feet tall?
Yeah, that's 7 feet tall. And they're like, no. And I was like, well, I grew up, my grandfather told me when I was little that he had an Uncle John that was real big, who I was named for, who could cut wood. They would have two people stack like logs, like cords of wood, like basically put up stumps. And he would have an axe in each hand and he could split them one after the other and as fast with just one hit and explode them. And the guy's job was just to keep putting it on. And he's like, he could split more wood because he used one axe, his hands, and he was so big and strong that he could just swing the axe with one hand and do the work of men with two hands. And so my uncle's like, or my grandfather told me a story. He's like, my Uncle John was like a mountain of a dude and could split wood. Now, yeah. So, I mean, like, I always like, that was a story I got told when I was a little kid, and I was there like, you were named for your Uncle John and, or my grandfather's uncle, So like story like that. And like people always ask me, I'm like, I don't know. I had this Uncle John that could split wood with one hand. Like that was the story. Like, so I'm always like, are there any stories like that lurking around? Nope. No, if you ain't got those stories, then, that's, like Derek Woodsky, a good friend of ours too, like had some funny stories like that about like relatives. And, a lot of guys in the NFL always have, hey, was everybody in your family big? Oh yeah. Like my one buddy was like, my grandmother was like 300 pounds and could like pick up like, 100-pound sacks of flour and throw them. And I was like, damn,
makes sense. Out.
I mean, there's a genetic piece to it, but, does it skip generations? Who knows, man? But I do think that the training that you expose your kids to early on, whether it be what I call athletic problem solving, whether it's running and jumping, climbing, trees and roofs and shit. Like, I think all of that goes into those early and formidable years. And I think what's happening, and I always hate to be like, these kids, but the screen is more desirable and more fucking engaging than nature is now. I mean, I see it. Like so I'm older than you, but we had 5 fucking channels on our TV. We never watched TV, because there was never anything on.
We had a dial that you had to turn, and my dad would go, once it would break, my dad would go turn the antenna, and we'd be like, no, go back, move it back. So we'd all sit as a family and try and watch, and if it was storming, he would have to move the antenna on the roof by himself.
Yeah,
and it's like, we watch 1 hour of TV a night maximum, and then you watch it as a family, and then the rest of the day we're just clowning around.
Yeah, dude, I like my Nick. Like we would take, I call it the clicker, right? Because which is like the, and it's funny to hear my kids call it the clicker, but the reason it's called the clicker was that when you turn the knob, it made a clicking sound. So one of us had to sit next to the fucking TV, and our job was to be the clicker, which is the guy that turned the knob on the different channels. So my dad would be like, this sucks, change it, and you go to the next one. And we would have to like sit there and do it. And we would like, Rochambeau or took turns. Yeah. And that's how shit worked. But like I was telling my kids, I'm like, I don't know if there was Netflix and Disney and all this shit, if I would have gone out, like there was never anything on. And like if we were in the house, my mom was going to yell at us to help, or we had to read books. So we just fucking left and went out and did whatever we did. And my brother and I still laugh about this. He's like, dude, like, I think we went and did it because there was nothing. I mean, it was either helping mom cook, cleaning something, or reading a book. Like, we're going to go. Like, can you imagine if like if we had, and this is always our joke. He's like, what if we had phones? Like, what if we had TV? And there was like all of these shows. Like we had Revenge of the Nerds, Back to School, and like one other movie on VHS. Oh, Weird Science. So we had them on VHS tapes, and we used to watch those movies, and then we'd occasionally get our parents to take us to like the movie theater or the VHS place to get a different movie. You come home and watch it, and like that was kind of the fucking end of it. There was nothing on TV. So I like hate being like, these kids, but like I don't know if we would have been any different with it was just a lack of opportunity. So we were forced to go out and do shit. Whereas now, like I just kind of scratch my head and I'm like, dude, like there's just so much. I mean, the fact that like, all their school stuff is on a computer. Like they like we were doing homework the other night. We did it on paper, and then my daughter had to go put it onto her Chromebook and like enter it in and then email it to her teacher. I was like, you remember when the first time I emailed a paper was 1996, and I was already in college.
Yeah, I think. I guess my question with all this is like, at what point? I mean, there's two things, because I always said, I just had this conversation with a guy at the gym where I was like, if I had phones, like, do you know how many times I would sneak out of my house to go to a friend's house, to go to a girl's house, and I knew I would never get caught because there was no cell phones. Nobody had a phone. Like, so that's like one factor. But then the other thing is, at what point do we like? So I think I might be like one of the millennial. I think I might be like the first millennial, like the first year. I was born in 84. And I'm like, when is it that we, instead of saying like, oh, these kids, dude, we're their parents. Like our generation is their parents. And really our generation is the one who needs to be like, yo, look, you get 30 minutes a week during the week for school. On the weekends, you get 45 minutes a week of 45 minutes on the weekend for screen time. The rest of the time, you are not touching the screen. And if our generation, like, it's not the kids' fault because we would have done the same shit. I would have done the same stuff. I would have been doing, like, think about this. I remember when you were talking about Flex magazine, the only thing that my dad let me do when I would go to the grocery store was I was allowed to stand in line, and they had the magazine section in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And it was like that different order and stuff. And you could go pick, like, there was a fantasy football magazine, but then there was the magazines for lifting. And I would, like, I could pick any of those, like Muscle and Fitness. And it was like, oh shit, I'm going to read this. My dad said I can buy one. Think about, like, today, all of that is so easily accessible to us on a screen or on the internet. So it's like, of course we wouldn't do anything different because it's so easy to do that. But it's still like, at some point, I feel like we need to be the ones that are like, yo guys, let's come up with some consistent theme here so our kids don't turn into total freaking zombies so that they can be the next. And you know what's funny too is I think there's parents that are doing it, and I'm trying to do that, right? But I also think there's parents that don't even think about it. So there's going to be this huge gap where you have these kids that grow up like a sensible, they're taking advantage of the technology, and then you have the kids that the technology is taking advantage of, and the gap of athletes is going to be incredibly wide because now you're going to see, you know, the cool part with in throwing and even in football is like I can record a throw like this, and then we can watch it on my phone, and we can watch all these little things and fix your technique immediately. Whereas before we used to have to record it on a VHS and then go rewind it. It would take way more. But then at the same time, it's like if not every kid's doing that, if a lot of kids are just using this to be on Snapchat or you know, watch whatever, it's like those kids are going to get totally destroyed by these kids that are more taking more advantage of the technology.
We're fucked. I mean, I try not to say it, but like it's, you know, I mean, like, you know, in the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about the GLP-1s and the trizipicide and, you know, Ozempic and this, and like, you know, there's some really great outcomes that are coming from these, but like, it just goes back to show that, like, you know, either the technology has gone so far that people can't thwart it. People have this inability to suffer and feel hungry. Like, every time I've ever been under 10% body fat and legitimately dieted, I've been hungry from the minute I woke up to the minute I went to bed. And going to bed hungry sucks. Like but that feeling of hungry is how I know I'm in caloric deficit. If I'm eating and I always feel like pretty full and like, oh, I feel good, I know I'm not in caloric deficit. Like the minute that all of a sudden I like start walking around the kitchen like a fucking modern hunter gatherer, like looking for something, that's good. And then I'm like, oh man, if I'm pacing the kitchen looking for something to eat, this is where I need to be. And then I just like enjoy being hungry. And that's like an interesting piece. But like food is so accessible. Things are so easy. They're hyper palatable. It's calorically dense. It's so easy. Like the fact that I refuse to download Uber Eats or any of these Grubhubs or any of this. Getting food delivered to my house and me not going out and getting it is like the last bridge I won't cross. I remember Matt Vincent, you know, from you know, Hate Brand, my buddy Matt. He's like, the fact that you go shopping, he goes, we order all of our food from Uber Eats and we don't ever go to the market. Like, it's a waste of time. I'm like, nope. If I'm hungry or I need to eat, I have to get in the fucking car. I have to go there. I have to shop and I have to cook all my own food. I refuse to like make it so easy. Like, I think we eat out one night a week. But like, I cook everything. My wife cooks. Like, we shop for everything. I take the kids to the market and I always tell them, I'm like, this is going to be out of style. You guys are going to be old telling your kids about when you used to go to the market with your dad. Now everything just comes on fucking Amazon, but you have to know how to do this. And I know it sounds so fucking archaic, but they've basically made everything so easy. Like, instead of being like I read today that there's a consortium, or one of my coaches emailed me, and he's a PhD, that Stanford started a consortium and is raising money to try to find a pill that will mimic aerobic exercise to build mitochondrial density and aerobic this. I mean, now with the GLP-1s, you don't really have to diet and have willpower anymore. It'll be behavior modification.
They have that pill. It's called nandrolone. That'll increase your red blood cell mass.
Yeah. I mean, we've effectively like gone at like, it's, fuck, I don't know, dude. Are we fucked as a people? I mean, unless we continue to go at this rate, but I think, and we were saying earlier that, human and men, I mean, men are much different than women. I mean, whether or not you believe in like, this whole transgender thing, I mean, at the end of the day, men are men, and the characteristics of men have been the same for millennia. And women are much more delicate in terms of like reproductive systems. So when they look at like how like, something leaches into the groundwater, they don't necessarily look at men, but all of a sudden they look at women and they're like, oh, this is causing these problems. So the impact on men, like we're dealing with the same hardware we've had, and probably the same emotional software we've had, but now all of a sudden we're adding this fucking like Buck Rogers Lightyear technology. And I think the reason that people just can't cope with it. And, the other thing I was telling that guy at the jiu-jitsu thing is one of the things that's always fascinated me since we started doing the podcast is the rate of men, and I didn't even know this until I turned 40, but the rate of men that commit suicide between the ages of 40 and 50 is like 9x any other group in time. Like dudes over the age of 40, maybe half of their life is over. And I mean, just all the factors. And so it's always been fascinating to me, but I think it's because, people for whatever reason, like aren't continuing to do these things. Maybe they don't make friends. I mean, a million different things. But like I said, the world that we're living in is not the world that we were necessarily evolved to be in. And we've only seen this within the last 100 years. But yet for the whole millennia, we lived in we're probably living in caves 1,000 years ago, It's it's an interesting piece.
You talk about Weston Price in the beginning, and I remember the first time I read his book and he talked to the Aborigines about suicide, and I want to say it was on his website. Like, I mean, obviously he's been dead since like 1926, I think, but it's like the Aborigines' response was like they couldn't comprehend what suicide was. Like they had no clue. Like, what do you mean? Like that can't happen. Like that's not possible. And like there was another group that had like a myth of like of somebody who like might have jumped off a cliff or something. I'm butchering that part, but it's like the societal construct also was more supportive. And not to get too hokey, but that's where I do think podcasting and to a point, some type of in-person discussion is a way of using technological mediums to like still have that connection of some, like, I think men are way more, we need more discussion time and more interpersonal relationships than we want to put off.
Yeah.
And I think like even thinking through how with the Weston Price stuff that we were talking about earlier, I remember reading that and being like, fuck, why would that be? Well, one, they were healthier, so physically healthier. So their ability to manage stress was probably much better, not just physically, but also emotionally. I would assume, and the construct of the society was healthier, because I think that can be a representation of the individual as a whole as well. And I don't know. What
dude, you're 100% right. To go back to a little Tyler Durden, the more shit you own, the more shit owns you. Think about the simplicity of their life, right? Wake up. Now I got to feed myself, right? So you either got to hunt or gather, do whatever you have to do. And your entire day is dedicated to feeding those and, protecting and surviving each day, whether it's capturing water or, food or whatever, then basically coming back, sharing, doing this, doing whatever you have to do house, and then you go to bed and you sleep again. I mean, think about the things they don't have to worry about. They don't have to worry about social media and bullying and all the other shit that, this or Ozempic or, I'm fat or this. I mean, like none of the modern problems that we've created exist. And, that the Weston Price stuff was super fascinating to me, because I kept thinking, why, like, and I know Wes and Price really put all of the emphasis on food, but my question was always like, why, and he talked about like the Inuit Indians being healthy. Well, they eat no carbohydrate. It was all meat and fat, like seal blubber and this. And then as you get closer to the equator, they ate more carbohydrates. So those ancestral diets were more carbohydrate based. That's an interesting piece that they figured out, that like there's a direct relationship between vitamin D and carbohydrate consumption. Like the closer you get to the equator in that part of the world, the carbohydrate consumption goes up. Like if you look at they're always like, oh, well, these people eat this. And it's like, well, if you look at the farther away you are from the equator, the less carbs, the closer you are, the more carbs. I mean, it's pretty true in that. But each one of those groups was eating, I guess the thread was that they were all hunter and gathering their foods. They were either growing their foods or killing it or foraging for it. So like, okay, so they were eating non-high processed foods. They weren't even really processed foods, but they were all eating different micro and macronutrients. So like, okay, so like how could, like we said, the Hadza and the Maasai and then the Inuits, right? They're all eating different nutrients, are all eating different this. They're all different in different places, but yet they're all healthy. Well, what's universal? And that was always a question I had when people start making broad base, like everybody should eat a carnivore diet. Okay, why? And I think if your gut inflammation and you're so sick and there's a lot of problems, that the only thing that you can digest. And when you hear people eating a carnivore diet that are extremely broken, they have these miraculous changes. Well, is it that the meat's saving them, or is it because they're removing all the bullshit out of their diet? I'm going with the latter. But then once they're healthy, we also know that gut bacteria, the people with the greatest diversity of gut bacteria are the healthiest people. Like I never got COVID. The gut diversity and bifidobacteria, all those are key factors for basically, avoiding that stuff. But the piece I always went back to with the Weston Price is like, you guys are talking about diet, but yet all these different groups that he observed all had different diets, but what was universal? So I think what it goes is they were probably living way less stressful lives in terms of like technological stress. Their exposure to chemicals and all the other stuff. They were living within nature. This microbiome that exists in the soil was symbiotic with them. That's the really only key. They had adapted to the diet that they were eating, and that was the best diet for them. So, I guarantee if you take those people and you'd be like, hey, we're going to take the Maasai and we're going to put them in the Arctic Circle and feed them the diet of the Inuit, they're not going to be healthy. Just like if you took the Inuit there and you said, hey, we're going to give you the Hadza diet, that's one test that nobody did. But I think really you as an individual have to find, what diet works for you, and whether that's through some gut testing or whatever it is. The amount of dysfunction in the microbiome, I really think that's like the next deal. We have 10 times more bacteria in the gut than we do cells. And that was what I was trying to get to when I was talking about the genetics dude. He said every gene that we have in our body can be expressed in an innumerable amount of ways based upon the gut bacteria. So the bacteria in the gut becomes the driver for all of these things. And so the thing he said to me goes, you might have had something within, the gut where if you didn't have it, this would become an issue, and maybe it didn't express in that way. So all I know is we're way fucking more complex than people want to. We were talking about training. That's the easy space. When you start looking at the complexity of humans, like, and anybody that's like, so I'm kind of religiously agnostic in that, where I observe that there's something bigger than us, because there's no way this thing fucking happened on accident. Like we didn't start as single cell organisms and now we're flying, spaceships. Like, do I know which imaginary friend's the best one? No. But do I open that and realize that the intelligent design of this thing, it's pretty fucking amazing. I don't even know what the fuck. I didn't ask a single one of the questions I had on lined up for you. No, I feel like we got to do another podcast. This is like 2+ hours. So we might have to do a 2.0. Fuck, dude. That 2 hours went by and I'm like, shit, dude, I didn't get a chance to ask my questions. Probably because I was talking the whole time.
started to get like really, really bad headaches. And I had never really had a headache. Even when I would drink heavily, I never got headaches. I would just get upset stomach. And so this is 30 to 29 years old at the time. Anyway, 2 years of trying to pay all these different doctors. I finally get diagnosed with Lyme disease.
Mm.
And I was thinking, he got super fat. He got slow. And he's like, all right, I gotta get bench a lot, squat a lot, blah, blah, blah. But that period of my life of getting super overweight led to me having Olympic microbiota in my gut, and then that led to some type of flu, blah, 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 blah. 2 years I had all of these terrible things going on with hormones and whatnot caused that disease. And then now, I've gone through a couple different phases, sort of like healing from trying to get better. And now lately, I've been having this issue with like, I get like severe diarrhea, and like that all this shit is still related back to me being fat ass from like 2002 to 2013.
Hey, dude, I'm gonna plug you in when we get offline, or when we hang up. I'll get your number. I'm gonna plug you in with Dr. Sabine, the guy we had on the podcast. You go back and listen to a few of them. She's probably the most gangster doctor I've ever. Gangster in like the best possible way. Where the work she's doing in terms of the gut, and I'll send you your stuff where you can get a test from her and do a stool sample, and then go back and get your stuff, and then I'll introduce you as my friend and be like, hey, this is a buddy of mine. Like, I want you to check him out because the way she's understanding this stuff is different than anybody else. So Lyme disease, and the way she explained it to me with the Lyme disease, if you don't have the gut bacteria for Lyme disease, if you get bit by a tick, now it's a problem. These people had the bacteria for the Lyme disease. So it's like, we don't get sick from the things that we have. We get sick from when the things that are introduced that we don't have. Mm-hmm. And so like being able to go back and kind of fix that. But like Lyme disease is like people have no concept of the effects of Lyme disease, and more importantly, like how to battle it and find it. And like my wife grew up in New Jersey, and fucking deer ticks and Lyme disease is big, and she's probably battled with that at some point. When we've got her blood work done, and it's always pops up as what's it called? It's I can't remember the name of the bacteria that God, I'll pull it up here. But yeah,
Larry
yeah. So it has it. And like, what's weird is, it's always hanging in the background, but certain things will happen where all of a sudden it rears its head. So as long as you can keep your immune system strong and like the gut diverse and bifidobacteria, the one thing that Dr. Sabine talked about is when kids are born, bifidobacteria is through the roof. Mm-hmm. And then over the course of a lifetime, it starts deteriorating. And all the people that basically she looked at in terms of like COVID that died had zero bifidobacteria. And it's one of the factors that they've seen within autism, that kids that are, have autism have low diversity and low bifidobacteria when they should have it high. And so she's, that's kind of an interesting piece we talked about, but it could be the fact that the bifidobacteria is low and like the diversity, and that you might have to do something on that side so that the Lyme disease is kept at bay. So it's almost like, you got to fortify your defenses. And so I know for me, like my diversity was really good, and I had a bunch of stuff, but then she made some recommendations. She's like, hey, I want you to do X, Y, and Z and kind of throw this and this and throw some things into your diet. Just because over time we kind of naturally narrow our scope a little bit. And it still stands true that the healthiest people on the planet are the ones that can digest the most amount of nutrients in food. So if all of a sudden you're in a position where like, I used to be able to do this and I can't digest this, it might be either the fact that something is going on and you're missing it, and we might have to try to reintroduce it. But that's kind of a weird piece. Like, hey, like Because I mean, you have a lot of people that are sick that all they can eat is meat. I mean, look at Jordan Peterson and his daughter. Like, she had terrible rheumatoid arthritis. They had to replace her ankle and her hip or her knee or something. And so she eats red meat. Now you're in a situation where you're like, every time I eat red meat, I get diarrhea. I mean, that to me is an interesting piece, but I'm going to introduce you to her.
It's been for me. It's so like I grew up like we sell raw milk at the gym here. I grew up literally drinking like half to 3/4 of a gallon of milk a day, 4 to 6 eggs a day. Like everything about me is like meat and that. And lately, probably for like a year and a half, it's been like I've had to slowly decrease that. And like dude, I don't really like chicken or turkey. I just don't like it because it's
called the Lone Star tick. Is a bite from what's called the Lone Star tick. Causes people to develop an allergy to like red meat, and sometimes that can be beef and pork. But there's this like meat allergy from what they call the Lone Star tick. They said it's predominantly in the southeast from Texas to Iowa and New England. So I mean, it very well could be that maybe something like that popped up. But like so for me, I kind of got rid of dairy. Like for some reason, I don't know where this happened. But I stopped drinking milk, and I still would eat some cheese on like occasion. And I think it was because, not that anybody said anything, but like, I don't know. I was kind of like, is it weird that we're the only mammal that drinks milk past weaning? Or is it weird that we're the only mammal that drinks the milk of another mammal, but we're also the only ones that wear shoes and fly and do other shit? Maybe the only ones that are smart enough to have figured it out. I don't know. And then we moved to Texas, and getting raw milk here is kind of laborious. Like I used to be able to go buy it at the store. Like you go down and be like, oh, they got the raw stuff. I just buy it. And like my daughters would drink goat kefir, and we just always did it. So when we moved to Texas, I kind of just stopped drinking milk. And so as I got my gut done, I kind of told her, and she's like, I want you to go and find like a gallon of raw milk, and I want you to drink like a 20-ounce glass once a week. And then she was like, the other one is like less than 1% of the population has any lactobacillus in their gut. And I was like, sourdough? She's like, yeah, sourdough or sauerkraut. And I'm like, oh, I like sourdough and I like sauerkraut. So she's like, I want you to do a serving of that every day. So we found this like old lady that makes this like insane, like 3 ingredient, like fucking sourdough. I got to get at the farmer's market. That's so dope. So I'll drive up there once a week, and I go get like a few loaves of sourdough from her, and then the raw milk. And then I just put like, I get this like high-end sauerkraut from the farmer's market, and I put that on there. But like the fermented, and the guy has like sauerkraut and fermented carrots, and I just fucking buy the pickles. I buy it all. And she's like, you just need to add those to your diet and a few other little things. And she's like, we'll see if we can improve and make your gut diversity even better. And, and then, she does some fecal transplants and some things, but she was like, oh, I'd, be a super donor. But that is our defense. That gut diversity and that bifidobacteria is our defense against everything. And she's like, the people that died from COVID, when they looked at them, had no bifidobacteria and low gut diversity. The people that had high gut diversity and bifidobacteria never got sick from it. So could it be, if we were talking about, the Weston Price and the ancestral model and these kind of hunter-gatherers, were their guts so robust that things like cancer and diabetes and illness and all these problems just passed over them, and they either died in some, violent way, or they just went to sleep and passed away? I mean, it's probably how humans died for a long time. They just probably just laid down and went to sleep and didn't wake up, more so than, whatever else has been. But the other wild one is, if you go back and read some of the stories similar, like you were talking about with like the suicide, like when they asked them about some of these issues, like they had never heard of like, what do you mean like cancer? What do you think? Like when they kind of described it, they're like, no, we've never had anybody die like that. So their stories of death were just like, oh, the people just didn't wake up one day, and then we figured they'd gone to the next place.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's also like I was telling somebody the story, and I haven't read the book in years, but there was a lake bed in Australia where they found fossilized footprints of these like 5 or 6 guys that were hunting an animal that was running. And based upon the size of the feet, the distance, and the amount, these guys were running like between 26 and 28 miles an hour.
What?
So this is pretty wild. So they found a lake bed in Australia. They found these footprints, and they were able to go out and measure like the size and the amount and the animal. So these like 3 dudes on either side were flanking and chasing an animal that was running, and they have its prints. And they knew based upon the size, the depth, and all the stuff, they could measure the speed and figure out like about how tall they were. And they were running. They were like 6 foot, 6'1". They were running at like between 26 and 28, Usain Bolt was running 29 and a half, but they were doing it over the course of like a mile on the lake bed.
Oh, that's well, think about this is,
but just some random dudes. I mean, so we got one dude in history that runs that fast. And even at the Olympics, like not even that Noah dude was he run 9.8? And there's a random lake bed with fossilized footprints that happened to catch 6 dudes that were chasing an animal at some point in time that would have been like on Usain Bolt's heels. Right. So the idea was with
a spear, probably.
Yeah. And they were running this animal down. I mean, so there's like, like we were talking about, these like the lore and all this, but like, that's kind of an interesting piece where, like, is it, and the guy made a book that like, we're de-evolving because one of, the natural selection piece, which is gone, infant mortality rates super low. We don't have, like the amount of, wars and death and, like the infant mortality rate, 100 years ago was insanely high. You look at like, think about people coming to this country, walking across this country for land and coming to the Comanches. I mean, like we've never lived in a time where things were this good. Food was this available, death and this, outcomes. And yet we seem to be less happy, which means that there's some semblance. And I had an interesting talk with my buddy, Doc Parsley, about this. There's something within the human spirit that like needs struggle and strife and battle and this, and like to be able to like persevere and fight that, like when things become so easy that like, death from discomfort kind of a deal, that like there's something within the genetic code. And there was a book, I can't remember the dude, I'm gonna fuck up his name, but he wrote a book, Lifespan. His name is Lifespan book. And I'm going to pull it up here.
My wife always says that it's just, she thinks it's purpose. It's like, what is someone's purpose? And there's a reason why, like Steve Jobs, I know it's like a corny using him as an example, but people make millions and millions and millions of dollars and they still want to work. They still want to do something creative because it's having that purpose, and that discomfort is part of their living. It's like, look, I need to have some struggle. I need to have something. You got to have a fight towards. Yeah. Otherwise, you're just you're toast.
So David Sinclair wrote the book Lifespan, and I don't necessarily agree with him on many things. One, he's like a vegan and eats once a day, and he's a little dude, so I don't buy into that for Lifespan. But he did make an interesting point when I was always fascinated why like sauna and these cold tubs, and why people have like, why, like, what is it about these practices make them valuable? And he talked about genetic expression, that when you sit in the sauna and it gets so fucking hot that all of a sudden you get in there and you get that like, oh shit, I got to get out of here, I'm going to die. That moment that happens, that's when you have to sit in there and get out. Or you get in the cold and you think, oh my God, I got to get out of here, I'm going to die. Like those moments when you get into that situation, you have positive gene expression. The genes are like, hey, we got to help this dude. He's a good one. Now they'll have positive gene expression. If you lay on the couch all day and do nothing hard and there's no battle or struggle, the genes are like, this guy sucks, let's kill him off. And so they talk about positive gene expression. That's why, doing something hard in the gym or going out and doing something hard, like the reason that probably, like you were saying, you grew up on a farm. The reason that like, my granddad and these guys that lived on farms lived to be like 80 and 90 years old and they were all still pretty functional was because they had to get up and do shit every day and there was nobody to do it. And so they're all like pretty strong, pretty virile because they had to these tasks. There was no point where they just like, they stopped working. That was when they usually died. Yeah,
exactly.
So, you got to be able to do something hard. There has to be a struggle. You have to get up every day and be like, what's the fight I'm going to tackle, or what's the hard thing? And, if the hardest thing you do all day is watch David Goggins hustle porn of him talking shit to you, and then you just roll over on bed and do nothing, like that's not a good thing.
Dude, that's so common too. That scenario you just painted is wild. It is so wild. How many people, it's like, yo, stop watching that and just go do this.
Dude, so we call it hustle porn. And Mike Sorelli, who's one of my buddies, who's a SEAL, he fucking dies because I'll send him these things. It's like, the hardest day is the loneliest moment that you have to go to the depths to be able to figure yourself out from the inside of the darkness to accomplish something. And it'll be like Goggins running by, and I'll send it to him and he'll be like, hustle porn. I'm like, this is great. And there's people that are addicted to it. These 100%. Motivational things.
Yeah.
And like, if it forces, it's like the Ozempic, right? If it forces them to get off their ass and go do something and fucking tackle some, I'm all for it. But if like all you do is lay in bed all day and just watch that stuff, so you feel worse about yourself, then like, all right. Like the Ozempic's a vehicle. Like the hustle porn's a vehicle to get you out. And be like, Goggins called me a piece of shit. I want to be less of a piece of shit. Let me go do something. And if that's the case, I fucking love it. Show up to jiu-jitsu and I'll choke you out. Like, if that's what it is. But I feel like people are addicted to like the hustle porn like they are the normal porn, which is crazy too. Cause I
wonder which one's more I bet you the hustle porns consume more.
Yeah. I don't know.
Because it's more open. Not people aren't open about like sexual porn consumption.
Yeah. The porn, like, so like, I don't have a ethical or like this, in this country, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm libertarian in this, like, live the life you want, right? Like, whatever. Like, if you want to be on OnlyFans and sell fucking stuff and there's weirdos that want to buy it, like, fucking make your money, dude. I'm happy for that. But I also am not going to somehow lead you to believe that what you're doing isn't like destroying your soul at your core. You know, I think like when, like, you know, sex workers and trading and that porn stuff, like that's, you know, you're basically making a deal with the devil and you're selling who you are for, you know, $29 or what. And, you know, I mean, like, so I kind of wrestle with this thing. And I don't necessarily blame the women or the people that are selling it as much as I blame the people that are buying it and being like, well, if nobody bought this stuff, this person would stop. But the fact that they're making like $43 million a month, like, fuck, dude, like that's crazy to me. Like, so like, good for them for making the money. How vapid are you as the individual to pay into this? And like,
it's wild.
It's fucking wild. So I view it from the other side. Like if this is what you want to do, that's fine. But like, you're selling your soul to the devil. But then on the other side, you're providing the silver. So it's kind of a like piece where like, I'm not necessarily against it, but paying into it is supporting it. Is that weird? So I'm always like, and also I always joke too. I liked playing football. I don't really like watching football. So use that analogy. Like, you know, I don't mind watching a football game, but it's not like, oh man, I'm so excited to get home and watch football. No, I like playing football.
However, the reason you probably don't like watching football is because you might hear other people talking and you're like, dude, shut up. You don't know shit about what you're talking about.
It's funny because my wife will hear me say things like we were talking about, like, oh, this guy's fucking awful. And, or this guy's really good. And she's like, how do you make this? Like, I'm like, cause I see it from the ivory tower. But I also, the other thing, football has changed so much for me. The game that I love and the game that I loved to play doesn't exist anymore. In the fact that like, you know, they turned this thing into fantasy football where it's just like running and gunning and like they changed the rules and these guys don't get hit and now people can run all over at a free. And like I watch a guy like Travis Kelce, who amazing job he's done with Taylor Swift. I'm so happy for what he's done. That guy's fucking crushed it. He and his brother, $100 million podcast, to the point my brother sent me a clip like, fuck, we should have been doing this. Good on him. He and his brother seem like great fucking dudes, but he's not even in my top 10 for fucking tight ends, right? He doesn't block anybody. He goes over the middle and catches the ball without getting fucking his head taken off by the Timmy Hawks or the Ed Reeds or the, you know, Cecil fucking Chuck Cecils of the world. I watched Michael Irvin get his career ended coming over the middle because Timmy Hawk fucking broke his neck.
And getting booed off the field. And
in a cart. Like I played in, you know, Broad Street Brawlers, right? Like I played on, you know, in the vet. Like I played, you know, New York Giants, like that type of football where it was like smash mouth, we're going to fucking kill each other. And like, that was the game that I loved. I mean, and now it's like, I watch Kelce step out, and the fact that people even put him in the same conversation with a guy like Tony Gonzalez, who played 17 years and I lined up next to, where if Tony was playing next to me and we had to get off the ball and double team a dude, he was going to murder the guy. I mean, he could block, he could catch, he could run down the field, he could do anything. And there was a lot of great tight ends like him. I mean, Gronk was like that. I mean, you even look at Jeremy Shockey and some of those guys. I look at Kelsey. He just looks like a, sweet receiver. And he's got Mahomes, who's over there fucking throwing the ball behind his back and doing shit. I mean, good on those fucking hillbillies from Ohio. He and his brother hitting that. Like, I couldn't be more stoked for him. But I also am not going to be romanced into saying he's not playing in a system that he's basically using his cachet to leverage a position that isn't fucking tight end. So yeah. So I mean, hopefully I didn't talk bad about him. I'm just telling you, as like having played the game and played line and played with dudes that are off incredible tight ends, just doesn't make the cut for me. So, but I do like watching football with my wife, and especially my daughters now that they're getting a little older, because they want to go to like football games. So my daughter went to a football game last night, and we were getting in the car, and she was asking me questions. So I was like, well, let's sit down. Your mom knows football. I was like, you ladies should play flag football. I'd love to come to your games. So, but fuck, dude, we're going to have to do another one of these. So either I got to come on your podcast, or we got to do a 2.0, because shit, man, I didn't get a chance to answer any of my questions.
That's okay. I'm down for it 100%.
All right. No, this was great, dude. So I don't necessarily know what we covered, but I feel like we covered a lot of ground. And so who's ever listening, strap the fuck in. Dane and I are trying to solve all the world's problems in one day. So
I think that's what it was.
Well, thanks for coming on this journey, and thanks for being on Power Athlete Radio.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by ko-fi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's ko-fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.